You probably clicked on this to fall asleep, but before we start, drop a like and subscribe. Now dim your lights and let the darkness begin. The aftermath of Saturday night always clung to the rusty mug like stale beer fumes. Sunday mornings were for slow starts, mopping up sticky spills and taking inventory of the damage, both structural and spiritual, inflicted by a crowd loosened by cheap whiskey and bad decisions. Sarah, however, added another ritual to this weekly purgatory, reviewing the security footage. It wasn't mandated by her absent boss, a shadowy figure named only as the proprietor, who communicated through cryptic notes left taped to the beer fridge. No, Sarah reviewed the footage because she was a creature of habit, a meticulous soul who found a strange comfort in the mundane rhythms of routine. This Sunday, the routine felt different. The Saturday night had been particularly spirited. A bachelor party had rolled in from out of town, their boisterous laughter and off-key karaoke attempts echoing late into the night. Then there was the usual Havenwood contingent, the grizzled regulars who nursed their sorrows in pint glasses, the young couples seeking refuge from small-town boredom, and the lone wolves who preferred the company of their own thoughts and a strong drink. The energy had been thick, almost viscous, leaving a palpable residue in the air even now, hours later. Sarah slumped onto the worn stool behind the bar, a lukewarm coffee cradled in her hands. The muted glow of the security monitor cast flickering shadows across the empty bar. She fast-forwarded through the footage, the silent images of the previous night playing out in a jerky, sped-up ballet of drunken revelry. She was mostly checking for anything overtly problematic, fights, thefts, overly aggressive advances that might warrant a polite but firm word with the perpetrator next time they shuffled through the door. Havenwood was generally peaceful, but the rusty mug was a magnet for the occasional lapse in judgment. It was during the peak of the Saturday night rush, around 11 p.m. according to the timestamp in the corner of the screen, that she first noticed it. The audio, usually a muffled hum of background noise punctuated by snippets of drunken conversation, became layered. It was as if another soundtrack had been laid haphazardly over the original, a ghostly chorus murmuring beneath the present-day din. She paused the footage and rewound slightly. There it was again, overlapping voices definitely, but not just overlapping in the way that naturally happens in a crowded bar. This was different. It sounded like two conversations happening simultaneously, yet somehow separate, distinct. One was the familiar cacophony of Saturday night at the Rusty Mug, the clinking of glasses, the raucous laughter, the strained chords of a poorly played guitar from the jukebox, and fragments of contemporary chatter. The other was something else entirely. It was fainter, a whisper beneath the roar, but undeniably present. It sounded older. The timbre of the voices, the cadence of speech, even the background sounds, they were all subtly, but unmistakably, out of sync with the present. Must be a glitch, she muttered to herself, taking a long swig of coffee. Cheap security system, probably picking up radio waves or something. She'd had issues with the system before, flickering images, static lines that danced across the screen like phantom scratches. Audio glitches were probably par for the course. She fast-forwarded again, dismissing it as a minor technical annoyance. But the anomaly persisted. Through different camera angles across different times of the evening, the layered audio remained. Sometimes it was barely perceptible, a faint undercurrent, other times it swelled, pushing to the surface, almost drowning out the contemporary sounds. And then something snagged her attention, pulled her back from the brink of dismissing the whole thing as faulty equipment. It was a phrase, a snippet of dialogue from the older, overlaid audio. Faint, crackly, as if recorded on old tape, but undeniably there. She rewound again, focusing intently, straining her ears. It was during a shot from the camera above the bar, capturing the usual Saturday night jostle for drinks. Amidst the contemporary din of someone ordering a double rye and another person asking for the game's score, the older voice cut through, clear for just a few fleeting seconds. Watch out for Hemlock tomorrow near the old oak. Loose branch, been meaning to tell him. Hemlock, old man Hemlock. Arthur Hemlock, a fixture at the Rusty Mug, a man as weathered and gnarled as the ancient oak tree that stood sentinel at the edge of town, the one everyone said was older than Havenwood itself. He was a creature of habit, Hemlock, his days as predictable as the sunrise. Every Sunday morning, without fail, he walked into town, stopped at the diner for breakfast, and then, always around noon, he'd settle onto his usual stool at the Rusty Mug for a single, carefully nursed beer. He'd tell the same stories, the same jokes, his voice a low rumble that seemed to carry the weight of years. The phrase echoed in Sarah's mind. "Watch out for hemlock, loose branch, old oak." It sounded like something from an old radio drama, a snippet of 1950s dialogue ripped from the airwaves. It was the kind of speech, the kind of phrasing that just screamed mid-century Americana. It was absurd, completely, utterly absurd. A glitch, a random radio wave, a trick of the audio processing. That had to be it. She shook her head, trying to dislodge the unsettling feeling that had begun to creep up her spine. She closed the security footage program, the screen going dark, plunging the bar back into the dim morning light. She finished her coffee, the lukewarm liquid doing little to soothe the prickling unease. She busied herself with opening up for the day, wiping down the bar, restocking the liquor, putting out the coasters. Anything to distract herself from the strange audio, the unsettling prediction. Sunday passed in its usual slow, predictable rhythm. A few early birds trickled in for hair of the dog Bloody Marys. Later, families arrived for early dinners, the air filling with the scent of burgers and fries. Sarah served drinks, made small talk, went through the motions, but the phrase from the security footage kept looping in her mind. "Watch out for hemlock, loose branch, old oak." Noon approached. Sarah glanced at the clock above the liquor shelf. 11:55 a.m. Hemlock would be here any minute. She found herself fidgeting, her usual calm demeanor replaced by a restless energy. She kept glancing towards the front door, half expecting, half dreading Hemlock's arrival. And then, right on cue, the door creaked open and Arthur Hemlock shuffled in just as he did every Sunday. He was a small man, stooped with age, his face a roadmap of wrinkles etched by sun and time. He wore his usual attire, a faded flannel shirt, worn overalls, and a battered baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He moved slowly, deliberately, each step measured, as if gravity itself was a heavier burden for him to bear. "Afternoon, Sarah," he rumbled, his voice gravelly but warm. He settled onto his usual stool, the one closest to the window, and nodded towards the tap. "Usual, if you please." "Hey, Mr. Hemlock," Sarah replied, forcing a smile. She poured his beer, her hands moving mechanically, her mind racing. He seemed perfectly normal, oblivious to any impending danger. Should she say something, warn him? But warn him about what? A vague, crackly prediction from a possibly glitched security recording. She'd sound insane. She placed the beer in front of him. He took a slow sip, his eyes closed in momentary bliss. "Just what the doctor ordered," he sighed contentedly. Sarah watched him, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. She couldn't shake the image of the old oak, the phrase "loose branch" echoing in her ears. The old oak, the one at the edge of town. Hemlock lived in a small cabin just beyond town limits, nestled in the woods, right near the old oak. He walked to town every Sunday. He would have walked past the oak tree this morning. "Mr. Hemlock," she began hesitantly, leaning slightly closer to him across the bar. Did you walk into town this morning along Hemlock Trail?" He blinked slowly, looking at her with mild confusion. "Why, yes, Sarah, same as always. Been walking that trail for nigh on 70 years. And did you notice anything unusual? Along the trail, near the old oak?" She felt ridiculous even asking. He pondered for a moment, scratching his chin, his brow furrowed in thought. "Unusual? Well, now that you mention it, there was a bit of a commotion this morning, just past the old oak. Squirrel must have gotten spooked, sent a whole mess of branches down. Startled me right good, it did. Had to step lively to get out of the way." He chuckled, a dry, raspy sound. "Lucky I'm still spry enough to dodge a bit of falling timber." Sarah froze, her blood turning to ice in her veins. "Falling branches," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "Near the old oak." Hemlock nodded, taking another sip of his beer. "Yep, good-sized branch too, cracked right off. Could have been nasty if it had landed on someone. Felt a bit of a breeze earlier, must have been enough to loosen it." He shrugged, dismissing it as a minor inconvenience. The air in the bar seemed to thicken, to press down on Sarah's chest. The overlapping voices from the security footage flashed through her mind, the crackly prediction, the mention of Hemlock, the loose branch, the old oak. It wasn't a glitch. It wasn't a random radio wave. It was real. It had happened, exactly as the recording had predicted. She stared at Hemlock, at his weathered face, at his oblivious contentment, and a wave of nausea washed over her. It wasn't just a glitch, it was something else. Something wrong, deeply, profoundly wrong. The casual dismissal of the audio anomaly from the security footage vanished, replaced by a chilling, bone-deep dread. "Mr. Hemlock," she said again, her voice trembling slightly, Are you sure you're all right?" He looked at her, a hint of concern flickering in his eyes. "All right, why wouldn't I be all right? Just a bit of a close call with a falling branch, that's all. Happens all the time in these woods." He chuckled again, but this time the sound didn't reach his eyes. "You look a bit pale, Sarah. You feeling all right?" Yeah, I'm fine," she mumbled, forcing another smile that felt brittle and fake. Just a bit tired, I think," she couldn't tell him. She couldn't explain the fragmented audio, the unsettling prediction, the impossible coincidence. He'd think she was crazy, and maybe she was losing her mind. But the knot of dread in her stomach refused to loosen. The coincidence was too precise, too specific, too impossible to ignore. She watched Hemlock finish his beer, tell a rambling story about a particularly stubborn raccoon he'd encountered in his garden, and then slowly, deliberately shuffle out of the bar. She watched him go, her gaze fixed on his retreating figure, a silent scream building in her throat. As soon as Hemlock was gone, Sarah practically bolted into the back office, the small, cramped space that served as her command center. She slammed the door shut, locking it with a click that echoed in the sudden silence. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. She practically ripped the chair from under the desk and collapsed in front of the security monitor, her fingers trembling as she fumbled with the mouse. She pulled up the security footage program, her eyes scanning the screen, searching for the Saturday night recording, the one with the overlapping audio. She found it, her breath catching in her throat as she clicked play. She fast-forwarded to the 11 p.m. mark, the time when she had first noticed the anomaly. There it was, the layered audio. She grabbed the headphones hanging on the side of the monitor and plugged them in, jamming them over her ears, blocking out the mundane sounds of the bar, focusing solely on the recordings. She rewound again and again, isolating the snippet of 1950s dialogue, the prediction about Hemlock. She listened to it over and over, each repetition sending a fresh wave of chills down her spine. "Watch out for Hemlock tomorrow near the old oak. Loose branch, been meaning to tell him." The voices were clearer now, amplified by the headphones, the crackle of the old recording more pronounced. There were other voices in the background of that older recording, faint murmurs, indistinct chatter, the clinking of glasses, the low hum of something. It sounded like a bar. It sounded like the Rusty Mug. But from the 1950s, that was impossible. The security system had only been installed a few years ago. It couldn't be picking up recordings from decades past. Unless it wasn't the security system. Unless the recordings weren't coming from the cameras themselves. A terrifying thought began to form in her mind, a chilling realization that sent tendrils of ice spreading through her veins. What if the cameras weren't recording the present, but the bar itself? What if the Rusty Mug, this old, creaky building steeped in history and folklore, was somehow leaking? Leaking sounds, voices, echoes from the past, bleeding through the fabric of time, superimposed onto the present. Havenwood whispered histories, thin veils between realities, local folklore. She had always dismissed it as quaint superstition, small-town eccentricity. But what if there was something to it? What if Havenwood, nestled deep in these ancient mountains, was more than just a sleepy Appalachian town? What if it was a place where the rules of reality were different, more fluid, more permeable? She scrolled back through the security footage, her fingers flying across the mousepad. She started listening to other sections of the recordings, focusing on the overlaid audio, trying to decipher the faint whispers beneath the present-day noise. It was like trying to tune into a distant radio station, catching fragments of signals, glimpses of a world just beyond reach. She found another snippet from earlier in the evening, around 9 p.m. This one was even fainter, almost swallowed by the contemporary chatter, but with the headphones she could just make it out. A woman's voice, breathy, panicked. "Don't go down to the creek tonight, Thomas, please." I had a dream, the water's angry, something's waiting. The voice trailed off, swallowed by static, then the contemporary sounds of the bar surged back in. Sarah shivered. The creek. Haven Creek ran right through the edge of town, a dark, fast-flowing stream that had claimed its share of victims over the years, according to local lore. The water's angry, something's waiting. It sounded ominous, like another prediction, like another omen. She kept listening hour after hour, her eyes burning, her head pounding, fueled by coffee and a growing sense of desperate urgency. She started taking notes, scribbling down fragments of dialogue, timestamps, camera angles, anything that seemed relevant. The overlaid audio was inconsistent, sometimes clear, sometimes almost inaudible, fading in and out like a weak signal. But it was there, undeniably there. She found more snippets. A man's voice, gruff, arguing about money, about a bad debt, about someone named Silas. A child's laughter, bright and innocent, followed by a woman's soothing voice singing a lullaby. A heated argument, voices raised in anger, the sound of something heavy being thrown, shattering glass. Each fragment a glimpse into another time, another story, another potential tragedy. As the hours passed, the initial fear began to morph into something else. A strange kind of fascination, and a growing sense of responsibility. If these recordings were indeed predicting future events, if they were omens, then she couldn't just ignore them. She couldn't just dismiss them as glitches. She had to understand them. She had to figure out what was happening. And maybe, just maybe, she could do something to prevent whatever terrible fates these echoes from the past were foretelling. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the bar. The first few regulars started to trickle in, drawn by the promise of cheap drinks and familiar faces. Sarah emerged from the back office, blinking in the dim light, her eyes bloodshot, her hair disheveled, but her mind sharp, focused. She felt exhausted, drained, but also strangely energized. She had stumbled upon something extraordinary, something terrifying, something that could change everything. She walked behind the bar, her movements slow but deliberate. She looked around at the familiar space, at the worn wooden bar, the scarred stools, the dusty bottles lining the shelves, the rusty mug. A place of secrets, of whispers, of forgotten stories. And now, it seemed, a place where time itself was beginning to unravel. She knew one thing for sure: this was no glitch. This was something far more profound, far more dangerous. And she, Sarah, the bartender of the rusty mug, was right in the middle of it. She looked at the security monitor, still displaying the paused footage from Saturday night, the ghostly voices murmuring from another time. She had a bar to run, drinks to serve, customers to attend to. But tonight, after closing, she would be back in that office. She would delve deeper into the recordings. She would unravel the mystery of the overlapping voices. She had to, because she had a feeling, a cold, unsettling feeling in the pit of her stomach, that old man Hemlock's close call was just the beginning. And the rusty mug and everyone in it was in far more danger than they could possibly imagine. The echoes of the past were growing louder, and Sarah knew with a chilling certainty that they were not just whispers anymore. They were warnings. The weight of the revelation settled heavily upon Sarah, a palpable pressure in the dimly lit bar. The initial shock was giving way to a grim determination. She couldn't dismiss it anymore. The falling branch, Hemlock's near miss, it was too precise to be coincidence. The crackly voice from the past wasn't just random noise. It was a warning, a message delivered across the currents of time. She spent the rest of her shift in a state of heightened awareness, every creak of the old building, every murmur of conversation taking on a new, unsettling significance. She served drinks, chatted with customers, but her mind was miles away, replaying the audio snippets, analyzing the fragments of conversations from the past. She started to notice other things. Little phrases overheard in the bar that day, mundane and innocuous at the time, now echoed in her memory with a strange resonance. A young couple arguing about money, had she heard a similar tone, a similar desperation in the overlaid audio. A boisterous group celebrating a birthday, was there a chilling counterpoint in the past voices, a sense of impending loss? As the last stragglers finally stumbled out into the night, leaving behind the hushed silence of closing time, Sarah felt a surge of nervous energy. This wasn't just about a glitch in the security system anymore. This was something bigger, something stranger, something that felt deeply rooted in the very fabric of the rusty mug, perhaps even Havenwood itself. She locked the front door, flipped the sign to closed, and headed straight back to the office, the small space now feeling like a clandestine command center. She booted up the security system again, the familiar interface glowing on the monitor screen. This time, she wasn't just casually reviewing footage. This time, she was on a mission. She started systematically cataloging the audio anomalies. She created a digital document, meticulously noting down every instance of overlaid audio she could find. Timestamp, camera angle, the content of the snippet, and the surrounding contemporary conversations, she recorded it all. It was painstaking work, requiring her to rewind and replay sections of footage countless times, straining her ears to decipher the faint, crackly voices from the past. Hours blurred into a focused intensity. The only sounds in the small office were the soft whir of the computer, the click of the mouse, and the faint, ghostly whispers emanating from the headphones. She felt like an archaeologist sifting through layers of time, carefully excavating fragments of forgotten conversations. As she progressed through the recordings, a pattern began to emerge, subtle at first, then growing increasingly distinct. Certain phrases, certain tones of voice, certain types of background sounds from the overlaid audio seemed to consistently precede specific types of misfortunes in the present day at the bar. For instance, she noticed that whenever she heard the faint sound of children crying in the overlaid audio, often accompanied by a woman's hushed, worried voice, someone in the bar later that evening would experience a minor accident, a spilled drink, a bumped head, a dropped phone. Harmless things individually, but when viewed in the context of the audio anomalies, they took on a more sinister hue. Then there were the instances where she heard raised voices, arguments, sometimes even the distinct sound of breaking glass in the overlaid audio. These seemed to correlate with more significant incidents, bar fights, heated arguments between couples, even on one occasion, a customer slipping on a wet floor and spraining their ankle. And then there were the truly chilling snippets, the deeper, more ominous voices, the phrases that spoke of danger, of loss, of something lurking just beyond the veil of perception. These, she realized with a growing sense of dread, seemed to precede the more serious misfortunes like hemlock and the falling branch. She cross-referenced her catalog of audio anomalies with the bar's clientele, mentally reviewing the events of the past few weeks, trying to connect the past whispers with present-day occurrences. It was like piecing together a macabre puzzle, the pieces scattered across time, the image gradually taking shape, revealing a disturbing picture. The voices from the past weren't just random echoes. They were warnings, omens. The rusty mug wasn't just picking up radio waves or experiencing technical glitches. It was listening, and it was speaking. Through the echoes of its past, it was foretelling the future, a future filled with minor mishaps and perhaps something far more sinister lurking beneath the surface. By the time the first rays of dawn crept through the dusty window of the office, painting stripes of pale light across the monitor screen, Sarah had amassed a substantial catalog of audio anomalies and their corresponding present-day events. The patterns were undeniable. The whispers from the past weren't just whispers. They were a language, a cryptic code being broadcast from the depths of time. Exhaustion gnawed at her, her eyes burning, her muscles aching, but she couldn't stop. The mystery had taken hold of her, a dark and compelling obsession. She needed to understand what was happening, why the rusty mug was leaking echoes from the past, and most importantly, what she could do about it. She knew she couldn't keep this to herself. She needed help, someone who could offer a different perspective, someone who could maybe make sense of the seemingly impossible. And there was only one person she could think of: Mark. Mark was her best friend practically since kindergarten. He was a fixture in Havenwood, a local history buff with an encyclopedic knowledge of the town's past, its folklore, its hidden corners and forgotten stories. He worked at the Havenwood Historical Society, surrounded by dusty archives and yellowed photographs, his life steeped in the town's rich, often peculiar heritage. He was also, however, profoundly skeptical. Mark was a man of facts, of verifiable data, of tangible evidence. He'd roll his eyes at ghost stories, scoff at local legends, and dismiss any talk of the supernatural as quaint rural superstition. Convincing him of the reality of the time-slipping audio in the rusty mug would be a challenge, to say the least. But if anyone could help her unravel the historical context of this strange phenomenon, it was Mark. Later that morning, after a few hours of fitful sleep punctuated by unsettling dreams filled with crackling voices and shadowy figures, Sarah found herself sitting across from Mark at the Havenwood Diner, the aroma of strong coffee and sizzling bacon filling the air. She'd called him earlier, her voice tight with urgency, asking him to meet her, hinting at something important she needed to discuss. Mark, as usual, was running late, his perpetually rumpled appearance suggesting a life lived in comfortable disarray. He slid into the booth opposite her, his brow furrowed with a mixture of curiosity and mild annoyance. "All right, Sarah, spill it. You sounded like the world was ending on the phone." Sarah took a deep breath, the diner's cheerful bustle a stark contrast to the unsettling weight in her chest. It's about the rusty mug, Mark." He raised an eyebrow, taking a sip of his coffee. "The rusty mug, what about it? Proprietor finally decide to show his face? Or did the health inspector finally shut you down for good?" Sarah ignored his teasing. "No, it's something weird, Mark, really weird." She hesitated, unsure how to even begin to explain the bizarre reality she had uncovered. "Remember how I told you about the new security system at the bar?" "Yeah, vaguely. Something the proprietor sprung for, right? Figured he was finally worried about someone making off with his prized collection of dust bunnies." "It's the audio, Mark, the audio recordings. They're picking up something else, something old." Mark chuckled, reaching for a piece of toast. "Old, like what, 80s power ballads on repeat? Because I swear, sometimes that jukebox seems stuck in a time warp." "No, not like that. Older, like decades older, like from the past." Sarah watched his face, bracing herself for the inevitable dismissal. Mark paused, the toast halfway to his mouth, his brow furrowing again, this time with genuine confusion. "From the past? What are you talking about, Sarah? Are you saying the security system is picking up recordings from, like, the 1920s? He let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "That's impossible. Security cameras don't work like time machines." "I know it sounds crazy, Mark. Believe me, I know. I thought it was a glitch at first, but it's not. It's consistent. It's layered audio. Contemporary sounds, and then underneath it, fainter voices, different sounds. Like two conversations happening at the same time, but from different eras." Mark put down his toast, his playful demeanor fading, replaced by a flicker of something akin to concern. "Sarah, are you okay? Have you been getting enough sleep? Maybe all that late-night bartending is finally getting to you." "I'm serious, Mark. I'm completely serious. And it's not just random voices. It's predicting things, bad things." She told him about Hemlock and the falling branch, about the snippet of audio from the previous night, the crackly warning, and then the almost unbelievable coincidence of the branch actually falling, narrowly missing Hemlock. Mark listened, his initial skepticism slowly giving way to a more cautious curiosity. He didn't interrupt, didn't scoff, didn't offer any of his usual dismissive remarks. He just listened, his gaze fixed on Sarah, his expression unreadable. When she finished recounting the Hemlock incident and her growing catalog of audio anomalies, a long silence settled between them, broken only by the clatter of dishes and the murmur of conversations around them. Finally, Mark spoke, his voice low, thoughtful. "Okay, Sarah, let's say, just for the sake of argument, that you're not completely losing your mind. Let's say there is something unusual going on with the audio at the Rusty Mug." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "What do you want me to do about it?" "I need your help, Mark. You know Havenwood history better than anyone. The Rusty Mug has been around for over a century, right? It's seen a lot. Maybe there's something in its past, something in Havenwood's history that could explain this. Maybe there's a reason why the bar is leaking audio from the past." Mark leaned back in the booth, considering her words. He was still clearly skeptical, his rational mind struggling to reconcile Sarah's outlandish claims with the world as he knew it. But there was something in her voice, in her eyes, a genuine fear and conviction that he couldn't entirely dismiss. And if he was honest with himself, there was a flicker of intrigue, a spark of historical curiosity, ignited by the sheer strangeness of her story. He sighed, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "Look, Sarah, I'm not saying I believe you. Not yet anyway. This whole time-traveling audio thing sounds like something out of a bad sci-fi movie. He paused, a wry smile playing on his lips. But you know me. I can't resist a good mystery, especially one with a historical angle. And well, Havenwood does have its peculiarities. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. Show me this audio, Sarah. Let me hear these ghostly whispers. And then maybe we can start digging into the Rusty Mug's past. See if we can find anything that might shed some light on this bizarre situation. A wave of relief washed over Sarah. It wasn't a full endorsement, not by a long shot, but it was a start. Mark, the staunch skeptic, was willing to investigate. That was more than she could have hoped for. Thank you, Mark, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you, you won't regret this. Don't get ahead of yourself, Sarah, Mark chuckled, though there was a hint of seriousness in his eyes now. I'm just agreeing to look into it. For now, I'm still operating under the assumption that your security system is just busted. But if there's even a sliver of a chance that you're right, well, then Havenwood might be about to get a whole lot more interesting. That afternoon, Sarah and Mark found themselves in the dusty archives of the Havenwood Historical Society. Surrounded by stacks of old newspapers, faded photographs, and brittle town records, they began their investigation into the Rusty Mug's past. Mark, in his element amongst the historical clutter, quickly immersed himself in the archives, his skepticism seemingly momentarily suspended by the thrill of the research. He pulled out old ledgers detailing the bar's ownership history, newspaper articles mentioning the Rusty Mug in its various incarnations over the decades, even old photographs of Havenwood's Main Street, capturing glimpses of the bar in different eras. Sarah, still reeling from the exhaustion of her sleepless night and the weight of her discovery, felt a renewed sense of purpose as she worked alongside Mark. She described the types of voices she was hearing in the overlaid audio, the approximate time periods they seemed to originate from, the kinds of events they seemed to foreshadow. Mark listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes, his initial skepticism slowly chipping away as they delved deeper into the bar's history. He discovered that the Rusty Mug had indeed been a fixture in Havenwood for over a century, originally opening its doors as a saloon in the late 1800s, surviving through Prohibition as a speakeasy, and weathering countless changes in the town's fortunes. As they sifted through the archives, they started to uncover hints of strange events associated with the bar, whispers of unusual occurrences that had been largely forgotten or dismissed as local folklore. An old newspaper article from the 1930s mentioned a fire at the Rusty Mug, a fire that had mysteriously started and then just as mysteriously extinguished itself, leaving minimal damage. Another article from the 1950s recounted a strange incident where several patrons claimed to have heard voices emanating from the walls of the bar, voices that seemed to be speaking in languages no one could understand. These were just fragments, fleeting mentions in the vast historical record, but they were enough to pique Mark's interest, to make him consider the possibility that there might be more to Sarah's story than he initially thought. He found records of unusual spikes in accidents and misfortunes in Havenwood that seemed to coincide with periods of intense activity or change at the Rusty Mug. He even unearthed old town legends, whispered tales of the bar being built on a site considered sacred or cursed by the indigenous people who had inhabited the area long before Havenwood was founded. As the afternoon wore on and the piles of documents around them grew higher, Mark's skepticism began to visibly wane, replaced by a growing sense of unease and a dawning realization that Sarah might be onto something truly extraordinary and potentially very dangerous. The whispers from the past, the omens of misfortune, the historical echoes of strangeness surrounding the Rusty Mug, it was all starting to weave together, forming a disturbing tapestry of temporal anomalies and forgotten secrets. And they were only just beginning to unravel the threads. Deeper into the afternoon they delved, the air in the archives growing thick with the scent of aged paper and forgotten stories. Sunlight slanted through the tall, dusty windows, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the stillness. Mark, initially animated by the intellectual puzzle, now moved with a more somber focus, his brow furrowed, his usual light-hearted banter replaced by a quiet intensity. He was tracing a different kind of history now, one that lay beneath the surface of official records and local boosterism, a history whispered in shadows and hinted at in obscure anecdotes. He unearthed an old, leather-bound town history, its pages brittle and yellowed, the ink faded in places. Flipping through it carefully, he pointed to a section detailing Havenwood's early days, its founding as a remote settlement carved out of the wilderness. "Listen to this," he murmured, his voice hushed with a newfound gravity. The land upon which Havenwood now stands was not always considered welcoming. Local legends passed down through generations of settlers speak of a time before Havenwood, when this valley was known by another name, a name rarely spoken aloud, for it was said to invite ill fortune. The indigenous tribes who once inhabited these lands held this place in a mixture of reverence and fear, believing it to be a nexus point, a place where the veil between worlds was thin. They spoke of spirits that dwelled within the earth, ancient entities that demanded respect and could bring either great blessing or terrible curse upon those who dared to trespass. Mark paused, looking up at Sarah, his eyes reflecting the dim light filtering through the archives. "Nexus point," he repeated slowly. "Veil between worlds. Does that sound familiar?" Sarah nodded, a chill tracing its way down her spine. "Thin veils between realities. That's what I was thinking when I was listening to the recordings." He continued reading, his voice taking on a rhythmic cadence as he deciphered the archaic prose. The early settlers, driven by a desire for land and opportunity, largely ignored these warnings, dismissing them as pagan superstition. They cleared the forests, tilled the soil, and built their homes, oblivious to the ancient forces they were disturbing. But the old ways do not easily relinquish their hold. Whispers persisted, tales of strange occurrences, unexplained illnesses, and misfortunes that seemed to plague those who settled too close to certain areas, particularly a rise of land near the western edge of the valley, a place marked by an unusually large and ancient oak tree. He stopped again, looking at Sarah, a dawning realization in his eyes. "The old oak," he breathed, "Hemlock's oak, it's mentioned here in the town history." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. "And the rusty mug, where is it located in relation to that oak?" Mark scanned the page, his finger tracing the faded text. "The description is vague, but it says near the western edge of the valley and rise of land. That could be where the rusty mug is." He pulled out a tattered map of Havenwood from a nearby drawer, its lines faded and creased with age. He spread it out on the table, his finger tracing the contours of the valley, searching for landmarks, for clues. "Here," he said finally, pointing to a spot marked with a symbol that looked like a stylized oak tree. "This is marked as Old Oak Hill on this old map. And look, this road, it roughly corresponds to Main Street today. And this building symbol, it's labeled the Tavern. It's right here, Sarah. The rusty mug, or its predecessor, it's located right near Old Oak Hill." Sarah leaned closer, her gaze fixed on the faded map, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to click into place with alarming clarity. The ancient oak, the warnings of a nexus point, the tales of misfortune, the rusty mug situated on potentially cursed land, it all seemed to converge, to point towards a darker, more sinister explanation for the overlapping audio than any technical glitch. Mark continued his research, delving into local folklore collections, dusty volumes filled with transcribed oral histories and regional legends. He found more references to Old Oak Hill, to the ancient oak tree, and to the land being considered a place of power, a place where rituals were performed, both benevolent and otherwise. He unearthed a particularly disturbing account, buried deep within a collection of local ghost stories, a tale whispered down through generations of Havenwood families. It spoke of a ritual performed decades ago, in the 1920s, during a time of great hardship and despair in Havenwood, a time of economic depression and widespread illness. Desperate to alleviate the suffering of their town, a group of Havenwood's most prominent citizens, misguided and desperate, had attempted a ritual, a binding ritual, meant to draw upon the power of the land to protect Havenwood and bring prosperity. But the ritual, according to the legend, had gone horribly wrong. Instead of drawing upon benevolent forces, they had inadvertently opened a doorway to something else, something dark and malevolent, an entity that fed on sorrow and despair. an entity that became bound to Havenwood, tethered to the very land beneath the town, particularly to the nexus point at Old Oak Hill. The legend claimed that the ritual had been performed near the old oak tree, and that the entity had become anchored to the land, its influence radiating outwards, affecting the lives and fortunes of Havenwood's inhabitants. The rusty mug, built so close to the site of the ritual, had become particularly susceptible to this influence, its very foundations steeped in the residual energy of the binding, its walls absorbing the echoes of the ritual, the whispers of the entity. Mark read the account aloud, his voice low and somber, the words hanging heavy in the air of the archives. When he finished, a profound silence descended between him and Sarah, broken only by the distant ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner of the room. Sarah stared at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and understanding. A ritual to bind a malevolent entity to Havenwood, and it went wrong. Mark nodded slowly, his gaze distant, lost in the implications of what they had uncovered. According to the legend, yes, it was meant to protect Havenwood, but it backfired. It drew something darker to this place. And the rusty mug, it's right on top of it, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. That's why we're hearing the voices. That's why the recordings are overlapping. It's not a glitch. It's the entity, its influence bleeding through time. Mark ran a hand through his hair, his usual skepticism finally completely shattered. He looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with a dawning horror. The overlapping dialogues, you said they were omens predicting bad things. Sarah nodded, her voice trembling slightly. Yes, hemlock, the branch, the creek, the woman's voice, something's waiting, it's all connected. The entity, it's feeding on sorrow and despair, and it's using the rusty mug, using the echoes of the past to orchestrate tragedies in the present. A chilling realization washed over them both, a wave of cold dread that settled deep in their bones. The overlapping dialogues weren't just random echoes from the past. They were the entity's voice, whispering across time, manipulating events, weaving a tapestry of misfortune around the rusty mug and its patrons. The bar wasn't just a place of solace and escape. It was a conduit, a focal point for a malevolent force that had been bound to Havenwood for decades, its influence growing stronger, its whispers growing louder. We have to do something, Sarah said, her voice rising with a surge of adrenaline, breaking the spell of horrified contemplation. We have to stop it. Mark looked at her, his expression grim but resolute. I know, he said, his voice firm, but we need to understand more. We need to know more about this entity, about the ritual, about how to break its hold on Havenwood. He gestured to the piles of documents surrounding them. There's got to be more here, more about the ritual, about the entity, about how to undo it. They spent the rest of the afternoon and well into the evening poring over the archives, their initial fear and dread slowly giving way to a determined focus. They were no longer just researchers uncovering historical facts. They were investigators, delving into a dark mystery that threatened the very fabric of their town. Mark unearthed more fragments of information about the ritual, piecing together a clearer picture of what had transpired in Havenwood decades ago. He found references to the group of citizens who had performed the ritual, their names, their motivations, the desperate circumstances that had driven them to such extreme measures. He discovered that the ritual had involved ancient symbols, forgotten incantations, and a blood sacrifice. A dark pact made in the misguided hope of securing Havenwood's future. He also found more detailed descriptions of the entity they had unwittingly summoned, descriptions that sent shivers down their spines. It was referred to by various names in different accounts: the Sorrow Eater, the Whisperer in the Vales, the Shadow of Old Oak Hill. It was described as a being of pure negativity, a creature of despair and suffering, feeding on the emotional residue of pain and anguish. Its influence manifested as misfortune, tragedy, and a pervasive sense of hopelessness that seemed to cling to Havenwood like a shroud. Sarah, meanwhile, continued to analyze the security footage, listening to the overlapping audio with renewed intensity, now seeing the whispers not as random noise, but as deliberate messages, as the entity's insidious influence at work. She began to recognize patterns in the voices, certain tones, certain phrases that seemed to precede specific types of misfortunes. She noticed that the entity seemed to be drawn to moments of emotional vulnerability, to times of sadness, anger, or despair in the bar, amplifying those negative emotions, feeding on them, and then twisting them into omens of misfortune. As they worked, a plan began to form in their minds, a desperate, risky plan to confront the entity, to sever its connection to Havenwood, to silence the whispers from the past. They knew it would be dangerous, that they were venturing into territory far beyond their understanding, but they also knew they couldn't ignore what they had discovered. They had to act to protect Havenwood, to protect the rusty mug, to protect themselves from the malevolent force that had been awakened beneath their feet. The sun had long since set, casting the archives into deep shadows, illuminated only by the dim glow of a desk lamp. They were exhausted, their eyes burning, their heads pounding, but they were driven by a shared sense of urgency, a desperate need to understand and to act. They had uncovered a dark secret at the heart of Havenwood, a secret that had been buried for decades, and now it was their responsibility to confront it, to banish the shadow that had fallen over their town. Mark leaned back in his chair, stretching his aching muscles, his gaze fixed on Sarah, his expression a mixture of apprehension and determination. "We know enough," he said, his voice low and serious. "We know about the ritual, about the entity, about its connection to the rusty mug. We know the overlapping audio is its influence. It's time to go back to the bar. We need to examine the place itself to see if we can find any physical traces of the ritual, any clues that might help us break its hold." Sarah nodded, her own fear overshadowed by a steely resolve. "You're right," she said, her voice firm. "We can't just stay here reading about it. We need to confront it. We need to go back to the rusty mug." They gathered their notes, their faces pale but determined, the weight of their discovery pressing heavily upon them. As they stepped out of the archives and into the cool night air, Havenwood felt different, changed, no longer just a sleepy Appalachian town, but a place haunted by shadows, a place teetering on the brink of something dark and unknown. The rusty mug, once a familiar haven, now loomed in their minds as a place of both danger and desperate hope, a place where they would have to confront the whispers of the past and the malevolence they had awakened. The journey had just begun, and the path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty and fear, but they knew with a chilling certainty that they had to face whatever awaited them in the heart of the rusty mug, for the sake of Havenwood and for their own survival. The night air was crisp and carried the scent of pine and damp earth as Sarah and Mark left the historical society. Havenwood was quiet, the usual sleepy stillness of the town amplified by the late hour and the weight of their discoveries. Streetlights cast long, distorted shadows that danced around them, mirroring the unsettling feeling that clung to Sarah. The familiar comfort of Havenwood had been replaced by an undercurrent of unease, a sense that something unseen was watching, listening. As they walked towards Main Street and the rusty mug, the silence between them stretched, heavy with unspoken anxieties. Mark finally broke it, his voice low and thoughtful. "So, we're thinking the bar itself is a conduit." Sarah nodded, pulling her jacket tighter around her against the chill. "It feels that way. All the historical evidence, the legends, the location, it all points to the rusty mug being right at the center of this nexus point. And the entity, it's using the bar to broadcast these omens." Mark continued, still trying to wrap his rational mind around the outlandish reality they were facing. "Broadcast, manipulate, maybe even orchestrate," Sarah replied, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. "It's like it's using the echoes of the past, the residual energy trapped in the bar, to influence the present to create these tragic events." "And Hemlock, that wasn't just a coincidence," Mark stated, more to himself than to Sarah. "That was a demonstration, a test run maybe, to show you that these whispers are real, that they have power." Sarah shivered despite herself. "It felt targeted, like it wanted me to see it to understand." "Which means," Mark said, his voice grim, "it knows we're onto it. Or at least it's aware of your sensitivity to the audio." "Sensitivity," Sarah scoffed, a humorless laugh escaping her lips, "more like cursed." "Don't think like that, Sarah," Mark said gently, placing a hand briefly on her arm. "We don't know what its intentions are, not fully, but if we understand how it works, maybe we can find a way to disrupt it, break the connection." That's the plan, Sarah said, trying to inject a note of confidence into her voice that she didn't entirely feel. We go back to the bar, we look for any physical traces of the ritual, anything that might give us a clue. And I keep listening to the recordings. Maybe we can get ahead of it, warn people, stop, whatever it's planning next. It's risky, Sarah, Mark cautioned. Going back there when we know it's aware of us, it could be dangerous. What choice do we have, Mark? Sarah asked, stopping in the middle of the deserted street, her gaze fixed on the darkened windows of the rusty mug looming ahead. We can't just ignore this. We know what's happening. We have to try. Mark sighed, his breath misting in the cool air. You're right, we do, but we need to be careful. We don't know what we're dealing with. This entity, it sounds powerful, insidious. We can't underestimate it. They resumed walking, the silence returning, but now it was a silence filled with a shared purpose, a quiet determination to confront the unknown. As they approached the rusty mug, the familiar neon sign casting a weak, flickering glow onto the deserted street, Sarah felt a strange mix of dread and a reluctant sense of homecoming. This place, this old, creaky bar, was now more than just her workplace. It was the epicenter of a mystery that threatened to engulf Havenwood. Sarah unlocked the front door, the heavy oak groaning in protest as it swung inwards, releasing a musty, stale beer-tinged smell that was usually comforting but tonight felt oppressive. The bar was dark and silent, the stillness broken only by the faint hum of the beer fridge and the creaks of the old building settling. The emptiness was unsettling, a stark contrast to the usual lively buzz of a Saturday night, or even the quiet murmur of a Sunday afternoon. It felt like the bar was holding its breath, waiting, watching. Mark flipped the light switch near the entrance and the bar sprang to life, the warm glow of the overhead fixtures chasing away the shadows, revealing the familiar layout, the worn bar stools, the dusty bottles lining the shelves. But even in the light, the unsettling feeling persisted. The air felt thick, charged, as if the very walls were listening, observing. "Okay," Mark said, his voice echoing slightly in the empty space, breaking the oppressive silence. "Where do we start?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, her gaze sweeping across the bar, taking in the familiar details, trying to see it with fresh eyes, to perceive the hidden layers beneath the surface. I think we need to start in the office," she said finally. "That's where the security system is. That's where I can access the recordings. And maybe we can find something there, something I missed before." They moved to the back office, the small, cramped space feeling even more claustrophobic than usual in the stillness of the night. Sarah switched on the computer, the monitor flickering to life, casting a pale, electronic glow onto their faces. She pulled up the security footage program, the familiar interface appearing on the screen. "You check the bar area," Sarah instructed Mark, gesturing towards the door that led back into the main bar. "Look for anything unusual, anything that looks old, out of place, anything that might be connected to the ritual. I'll review the recordings, see if there are any new predictions." Mark nodded, his expression serious. "Be careful, Sarah. If you hear anything strange, call out." Sarah plugged in her headphones, the familiar weight pressing against her ears, isolating her from the outside world, plunging her back into the unsettling realm of the overlapping audio. She started reviewing the footage from earlier that evening, fast-forwarding through the mundane scenes of customers chatting, drinking, laughing, the usual background noise of the rusty mug on a quiet Monday night. As she listened, she felt a prickling sensation at the back of her neck, a sense of being watched, of being listened to. The silence of the bar seemed to press in on her, amplified by the headphones, making the faint sounds of the recording seem louder, more significant. Suddenly, amidst the contemporary hum of the bar, she heard it again. The layered audio, fainter, more indistinct than before, but undeniably present. She paused the footage, rewound slightly, and listened intently. It was a man's voice, low, gravelly, speaking in a hushed tone. "The delivery tonight, make sure it's the usual route. Avoid Willow Creek Bridge, a road's been unstable lately." Willow Creek Bridge. Sarah's blood ran cold. Willow Creek Bridge was a narrow, rickety old bridge on the outskirts of Havenwood, a shortcut often used by delivery trucks coming into town from the north. And the delivery tonight, that could only mean the weekly liquor delivery, scheduled for late Monday nights, always arriving after closing time. The delivery driver, a young man named Billy, was a regular at the Rusty Mug, a friendly, easygoing kid who always had a joke or story to share. "Mark," Sarah called out, ripping off the headphones, her voice sharp with urgency. "Mark, come here. I think there's another one." Mark rushed back into the office, his face etched with concern. "What is it? What did you hear?" Sarah quickly explained the audio snippet, the mention of delivery tonight, Willow Creek Bridge, unstable road. "It sounds like a warning, but twisted like it's meant to cause an accident," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "The liquor delivery, it's due tonight. Billy always takes Willow Creek Bridge. He's going to be in trouble." Mark's eyes widened with alarm. "We have to warn him. We have to call him, stop him before he leaves for the delivery." Sarah scrambled for her phone, her fingers fumbling as she searched for Billy's number in her contacts. She found it, her thumb hovering over the call button, a wave of doubt washing over her. How could she explain this to Billy? "Hey Billy, don't take Willow Creek Bridge tonight. Some creepy voices from the past on my security system told me it's unstable." He'd think she was completely insane. "What do I say?" Sarah whispered, her voice filled with desperation. "He'll never believe me. He'll think I'm crazy." "We have to try, Sarah," Mark urged, his voice firm. "We can't just stand here and do nothing. Tell him there's been a report of structural damage to the bridge, that the town is advising drivers to avoid it. Anything, just warn him." Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself, and pressed the call button. The phone rang, each ring echoing loudly in the tense silence of the office, amplifying her anxiety. Finally, Billy answered, his voice cheerful and upbeat. "Hey, Sarah, what's up? Bar out of beer already." "Hey, Billy," Sarah said, forcing a casual tone into her voice, trying to mask the frantic urgency she felt. "Listen, I just wanted to give you a heads up. I heard there's been some kind of issue with Willow Creek Bridge. Structural damage, maybe. Something about it being unstable." Billy chuckled. "Willow Creek Bridge, unstable. That old thing's been unstable since before I was born, everyone knows that. But it's the fastest way into town, especially this late. Why, what's going on?" "Well, I just heard there's been a new report, more serious this time," Sarah continued, improvising wildly, her mind racing. "The town, they're advising drivers to avoid it tonight, just to be safe." Billy hesitated for a moment, his cheerful tone wavering slightly. "Really? Town's advising to avoid it? Huh, never heard anything about that. But well, better safe than sorry, I guess. Maybe I'll take the long way around tonight just to be sure. Thanks for the heads up, Sarah. You're a lifesaver." "No problem, Billy," Sarah said, relief flooding through her as she heard the slight shift in his tone, the hint of caution creeping into his voice. Just be careful, okay?" "Will do," Billy replied. "See you tomorrow, Sarah." He hung up, and Sarah let out a shaky breath, collapsing back into her chair, her body trembling with adrenaline. "He's going to take the long way," she said, her voice weak with relief. "He's going to avoid the bridge." Mark let out a sigh of his own, running a hand through his hair. "Thank God, maybe we can actually do something. Maybe we can change things." They watched the security footage in tense silence, waiting for the time of the liquor delivery, their eyes fixed on the camera angle that showed the road leading towards Willow Creek Bridge. Minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity. The clock on the monitor ticked slowly, each second amplifying the tension in the small office. Finally, around midnight, headlights appeared in the distance, approaching Willow Creek Bridge. Sarah held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She watched as the delivery truck, its headlights cutting through the darkness, approached the bridge, slowed down. And then, instead of turning onto the bridge, it continued straight, taking the detour, the longer route around Willow Creek. Relief washed over Sarah in a tidal wave, so intense it almost brought her to her knees. They had done it. They had warned Billy, and he had listened. They had averted the tragedy, changed the course of events. For the first time since discovering the overlapping audio, Sarah felt a flicker of hope, a sense of empowerment. Maybe they weren't powerless after all. Maybe they could fight back against the entity's insidious influence. "We did it, Mark," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with awe. "We actually did it." Mark smiled, a genuine smile of relief and triumph. "We did," he echoed, his eyes shining with a newfound optimism. "We warned him and he listened. We changed the future, Sarah. We actually changed the future." They watched the security footage, their tension easing, their hopes rising. The delivery truck disappeared from view, taking the long way around, safely bypassing Willow Creek Bridge. They had won. They had defied the entity, proven that its predictions weren't inescapable. But then, just as they were starting to relax, to celebrate their small victory, something shifted. The audio, which had been relatively quiet, the overlaid whispers fading into the background, suddenly surged, growing louder, more insistent. The crackly voices from the past intensified, drowning out the contemporary sounds of the bar, becoming almost deafening in their intensity. And within the cacophony, Sarah heard a new voice, a voice she hadn't heard before, deeper, colder, more menacing than any of the previous whispers. It was a low, guttural voice, resonating with an ancient, malevolent power. And it was speaking directly, clearly, no longer a fragmented snippet of dialogue, but a deliberate, chilling message. You cannot change what is destined. The voice echoed in her headphones, reverberating through her skull, sending shivers of ice down her spine. The bar lights flickered, the air in the office grew cold, and a palpable sense of dread descended upon them, crushing their newfound hope, replacing it with a chilling, inescapable fear. On the security monitor, the camera angle showing the road leading away from Willow Creek Bridge suddenly flickered, distorting, then dissolving into static. The signal was lost, the screen going black, leaving only the ghostly whispers echoing in Sarah's headphones, the chilling pronouncement hanging heavy in the air. You cannot change what is destined. Then from the main bar area, they heard a sudden sharp crash, the unmistakable sound of shattering glass, followed by a low, drawn-out groan, a sound of pain and anguish. Sarah and Mark froze, their blood turning to ice in their veins, their brief moment of triumph dissolving into a cold, horrifying dread. They had warned Billy, diverted the tragedy at Willow Creek Bridge, but the entity, it seemed, had simply redirected its aim. Fate, it seemed, was not so easily cheated. And the rusty mug and everyone within its reach were still very much in its insidious grip. The chilling declaration hung in the air of the small office. You cannot change what is destined. Then the crash, sharp and violent, followed by a guttural sound that was undeniably human pain. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. The relief, the fragile hope, shattered as completely as the glass in the bar. Mark, she gasped, scrambling to her feet, ripping the headphones off entirely. She stumbled out of the office, Mark right behind her, his face a mask of alarm. They burst into the main bar area, their eyes scanning the scene, hearts pounding in their chests. The source of the crash was immediately apparent. Behind the bar, near the far end where Sarah usually mixed drinks, a shelf of liquor bottles had collapsed. Glass shards glittered on the floor, reflecting the dim bar lights like fallen stars, mingling with the dark pools of spilled liquor that spread across the worn wooden surface. And slumped against the back wall, amidst the wreckage of broken bottles, was Old Man Fitzwilliam, one of the rusty mug's oldest regulars. Fitzwilliam was usually a fixture on his stool at the end of the bar, nursing a single beer for hours, his eyes twinkling with wry amusement as he watched the comings and goings of the bar's patrons. Tonight he had been the only customer, a solitary figure in the otherwise empty space, seeking his usual quiet solace. Now he was slumped against the wall, his face contorted in pain, his hand clutching his leg. A dark stain was spreading across his trousers. Mr. Fitzwilliam, Sarah cried, rushing towards him, Mark close behind. What happened? Are you all right? Fitzwilliam groaned again, his face pale and clammy. Shelf came down out of nowhere, he gasped, his voice weak and strained. Leg, think it's broken. Mark was already kneeling beside him, gently examining his leg. Looks like it, Fitzwilliam, Mark said grimly. Something heavy must have hit it. We need to call an ambulance. Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone again, her mind reeling. The shelf, it had just collapsed, out of nowhere, just after the entity's chilling message, just after they had seemingly cheated fate with Billy and the bridge. It was too precise, too targeted to be a coincidence. The entity hadn't been thwarted. It had merely shifted its focus, redirected the tragedy. And Old Man Fitzwilliam had become the unfortunate substitute for Billy, the bridge replaced by a falling shelf of liquor bottles. As she dialed 911, her voice shaking as she explained the situation, the reality of what was happening crashed down on her with full force. This wasn't just about strange audio recordings or whispered predictions. This was real. People were getting hurt. The entity was actively manipulating events, twisting fate to its own malevolent ends. And she, Sarah, was caught in the middle of it, a helpless witness to its insidious game. The ambulance arrived quickly, sirens wailing through the quiet Havenwood night, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows across the bar. Paramedics rushed in, their movements efficient and professional as they assessed Fitzwilliam's injuries, carefully lifting him onto a stretcher and carrying him out of the bar and into the waiting ambulance. Sarah and Mark watched them go, the flashing lights receding into the darkness, leaving behind a heavy silence in the bar, broken only by the drip, drip, drip of spilled liquor and the lingering scent of broken glass and whiskey. "It had got him anyway," Sarah whispered, her voice hollow with despair. "We saved Billy, but it just found another way." Mark stood beside her, his face grim, his initial hope extinguished. It's like it's playing a game with us, Sarah," he said, his voice low. "Like it's showing us that we can't win, that we can't escape its influence." Sarah felt a wave of nausea wash over her, a dizzying sense of helplessness. The entity's message echoed in her mind. "You cannot change what is destined." It felt like a taunt, a cruel reminder of their powerlessness in the face of this ancient, malevolent force. They spent the rest of the night cleaning up the broken glass and spilled liquor, the mundane task a futile attempt to impose order on the chaos that had been unleashed in the rusty mug. The silence in the bar was oppressive, broken only by the clinking of glass and the scraping of brooms, each sound amplifying their sense of unease. As they worked, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being listened to. The entity felt present, palpable, its malevolent gaze fixed upon them, observing their every move, gloating in its victory. The whispers from the past seemed to grow louder, more insistent, swirling around her, mocking her attempts to intervene, to change fate. Sleep offered no escape. When Sarah finally stumbled back to her small apartment above the bar, exhaustion dragging at her limbs, she collapsed into bed, hoping for oblivion. But oblivion eluded her. Instead, she was plunged into a nightmarish landscape, a chaotic jumble of images and sounds ripped from the security footage, from the historical archives, from the depths of Havenwood's forgotten past. She was back in the 1920s rusty mug, surrounded by flapper dresses and jazz music, but the laughter was hollow, the music distorted, and the faces of the patrons were blurred and indistinct, their eyes empty sockets staring accusingly at her. Then the scene shifted, morphing into a dark forest, the ancient oak looming overhead, its branches gnarled and twisted like skeletal fingers, reaching down to grasp her. Whispers swirled around her, crackly voices murmuring fragments of warnings, predictions, and chilling pronouncements of doom. She saw Fitzwilliam falling, the shelf collapsing, Billy's truck plunging into the abyss of Willow Creek, a kaleidoscope of tragedies unfolding before her eyes, all orchestrated by the unseen entity, all directed at her. She woke up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The apartment was dark and silent, the first faint light of dawn just beginning to filter through the curtains. But the echoes of the nightmare lingered, the whispers still ringing in her ears, the chilling pronouncement, "You cannot change what is destined," burned into her mind. The day that followed was a blur of exhaustion and mounting paranoia. Sarah moved through her bartending shift like a ghost, serving drinks, making small talk, going through the motions. But her mind was consumed by the entity, by the whispers, by the growing sense of dread that clung to her like a shroud. The bar was quiet, unusually so, even for a Tuesday. The usual regulars were absent, perhaps sensing the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over the rusty mug, or perhaps simply staying away out of a subconscious unease. The few patrons who did come in were subdued, their conversations hushed, their laughter muted. The air felt heavy, charged with a palpable tension, as if everyone in the bar could feel the unseen presence, the malevolent gaze that watched from the shadows. Throughout the day, the audio anomalies continued, subtly at first, then growing more insistent. Faint whispers overlaid the contemporary sounds of the bar, fragments of conversations from the past, snippets of warnings, omens, and chilling pronouncements. Sarah tried to decipher them, to find a pattern, to understand the entity's intentions, but the whispers were fragmented, chaotic, seemingly random, designed to confuse and disorient her. She started to doubt her own sanity. Were these whispers real, or were they just figments of her imagination, manifestations of her own growing fear and paranoia? Was she truly hearing voices from the past, or was her mind playing tricks on her, conjuring up these unsettling sounds in response to the stress and trauma of the past few days? She confided in Mark, her voice trembling as she described her nightmares, her hallucinations, her growing doubts about the reality of the audio anomalies. Mark listened patiently, his expression concerned, but he didn't dismiss her fears, didn't tell her she was imagining things. He had heard the whispers himself. He had witnessed the events at Willow Creek Bridge, and with Fitzwilliam, he knew that something real and terrifying was happening at the Rusty Mug. "It's trying to break you, Sarah," Mark said, his voice gentle but firm. "It's trying to make you doubt yourself, to make you question your own sanity. Don't let it. You're not imagining things. The whispers are real. The entity is real. We have to stay strong, Sarah. We have to fight back." But fighting back felt increasingly futile. Each attempt to intervene, to change fate, seemed to backfire, to only strengthen the entity's grip on Havenwood, to amplify its malevolent influence. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, more targeted, focusing directly on Sarah, preying on her fears, her anxieties, her deepest insecurities. One evening, as she was reviewing the security footage, trying to decipher a particularly persistent snippet of overlaid audio, she heard her own name whispered from the headphones. Not just her name, but her full name, Sarah Miller, spoken in a cold, disembodied voice that seemed to resonate from the depths of the recordings, from the very fabric of the Rusty Mug itself. "Sarah Miller, watch the shadows, they lengthen for you." Sarah froze, her blood turning to ice in her veins. Her own name, spoken by the entity, a direct address, a personal threat. It was no longer just manipulating events, orchestrating tragedies, whispering omens. It was now directly targeting her, singling her out, making her the focus of its malevolence. "The shadows, they lengthen for you," the words echoed in her mind, ominous and chilling. She looked around the small office, the dim light casting long, distorted shadows across the walls, the familiar space suddenly feeling menacing, claustrophobic, filled with unseen eyes watching her from the darkness. Paranoia gripped her, tightening its icy fingers around her heart. She started seeing shadows move in the periphery of her vision, hearing whispers in the silence of the bar, feeling a cold presence lurking just beyond the edge of her awareness. The line between reality and hallucination began to blur, the whispers from the past merging with her own thoughts, her own fears, creating a terrifying tapestry of paranoia and dread. She jumped at every creak of the old building, every rustle of leaves outside the window, every unexpected sound in the bar. She started locking herself in the office during her shifts, afraid to be alone in the main bar area, convinced that the entity was watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake, to slip up, to become vulnerable. Sleep offered no respite, the nightmares growing more vivid, more disturbing, blurring the lines between dream and reality. She saw faces from the past, distorted and grotesque, whispering her name, pointing accusingly at her, blaming her for unleashing the entity, for disturbing the balance of Havenwood's dark history. One night she dreamt she was walking through the Rusty Mug, but the bar was different, transformed into a labyrinthine maze of corridors and rooms, stretching endlessly into the darkness. The walls were lined with security monitors, each screen displaying a different scene from the past, from the history of Havenwood, from the entity's long, insidious reign. And in each screen she saw herself, Sarah Miller, a shadowy figure lurking in the background, a silent observer, a helpless witness to the unfolding tragedies. Then the monitors began to flicker, the images distorting, merging into a swirling vortex of darkness. The whispers grew deafening, surrounding her, engulfing her, voices from every era of Havenwood's past, all speaking at once, all directed at her, accusing, threatening, promising pain and despair. And from the heart of the vortex, the cold, guttural voice of the entity boomed, "Yours is the sorrow now." Sarah woke up screaming, bolting upright in bed, her body drenched in sweat, her heart hammering against her ribs. The apartment was silent, the first rays of dawn painting the sky with pale light. But the terror lingered, clinging to her like a second skin, the entity's words echoing in her mind, "Yours is the sorrow now." She knew with a chilling certainty that the entity was no longer just manipulating events in the rusty mug, no longer just whispering omens from the past. It was now directly targeting her, breaking down her defenses, preying on her mind, isolating her, preparing to claim her as its own. The shadows were lengthening, just as it had warned, and Sarah Miller, the bartender of the rusty mug, was walking deeper and deeper into the darkness, with no escape in sight. The whispers were no longer just warnings. They were a prelude to something far more terrifying, something that was about to engulf her completely. The chilling words, "Yours is the sorrow now," echoed in the hollow chambers of Sarah's mind long after she clawed her way back to consciousness. Dawn painted the sky in hues of bruised purple and pale gray, mirroring the emotional landscape within her. The terror of the nightmare hadn't dissipated with the fading darkness. It clung to her, a suffocating weight on her chest. She felt utterly exposed, stripped bare by the entity's insidious attention. The bar, once a place of routine and a semblance of normalcy, now felt like a stage set for her personal torment. Dragging herself out of bed felt like an act of monumental will. The thought of facing another day in the rusty mug, knowing the entity was watching, listening, waiting, was almost unbearable. But the alternative, succumbing to the fear, giving in to the despair that the entity seemed to crave, was even worse. She had to fight, not just for herself, but for Havenwood, for the memory of Old Man Fitzwilliam, for everyone who had ever sought refuge within the worn walls of the rusty mug. She called Mark, her voice raspy and unsteady. He answered on the second ring, his own voice laced with weariness. "Mark, it's getting worse," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "It spoke to me, directly. In the recordings, it said the shadows are lengthening for me." A heavy silence followed on the other end of the line. Then Mark's voice, quiet but resolute, broke through. "We're not going to let that happen, Sarah. We're not going to let it win." "But what can we do?" Sarah's voice was laced with desperation. "We tried to change fate, and it just shifted the tragedy. It's like we're trapped in its game, and it's always going to be one step ahead." "Maybe," Mark conceded, "but we can't give up. We have to keep looking for answers. We have to find a way to break its hold." He paused, and Sarah could almost hear him thinking, his mind working through the problem with his characteristic methodical approach. "Remember those old town histories we found, and the folklore collections? Maybe there's more there. Maybe we missed something. Something about the ritual itself, or about the entity's weaknesses." The idea sparked a flicker of hope in Sarah's weary mind. "You think so?" "It's worth a try, isn't it?" Mark said, his voice gaining strength. "We can't just sit here and wait for the shadows to lengthen. We need to be proactive. We need to dig deeper." They agreed to meet at the Historical Society again that morning. The prospect of returning to the dusty archives was hardly appealing, but it was a direction, a purpose, something to cling to in the face of the overwhelming dread. As Sarah prepared to leave for the day, she glanced around her small apartment above the rusty mug. Even here, away from the bar itself, she felt the entity's presence, a cold, unseen weight pressing down on her. The shadows in her own apartment seemed to deepen, to lengthen, just as the entity had warned. At the Historical Society, Mark was already waiting, surrounded by stacks of books and papers, his brow furrowed in concentration. The familiar scent of aged paper and leather hung in the air, a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere she had left behind at the rusty mug. For a moment, in the quiet stillness of the archives, she felt a brief respite from the entity's relentless gaze. "I've been going through the folklore collections again," Mark said, gesturing to the piles of books surrounding him. "Specifically looking for anything more detailed about the ritual itself. There were those mentions of symbols and incantations, and the blood sacrifice. Maybe there's more information hidden somewhere." They spent the morning immersed in the dusty volumes, their eyes scanning faded pages, searching for any clue, any detail that might shed light on the original ritual and the entity it had unleashed. They reread the town history, the newspaper articles, the transcribed oral histories, their focus narrowed, their determination sharpened by the events of the previous night. Hours passed, marked only by the turning of pages and the occasional hushed whisper as one of them stumbled upon a potentially relevant passage. The sunlight filtering through the tall windows shifted, casting long shadows across the room, a subtle reminder of the entity's chilling warning. Sarah felt a growing sense of frustration. They were surrounded by information, by history, by stories of Havenwood's past, but the specific details they needed seemed to remain elusive, hidden beneath layers of folklore and forgotten anecdotes. "Maybe we're looking in the wrong place," Sarah said finally, her voice heavy with discouragement. "Maybe the answers aren't here. Maybe they're in the bar itself. The ritual was performed near the old oak, but the entity is bound to the rusty mug. Maybe there are traces of the ritual there, physical clues we've overlooked." Mark considered her words, his brow furrowed in thought. "You mean hidden within the bar, like secret passages or something?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted, shrugging her shoulders, "but it's an old building, Mark, over a century old. Who knows what secrets it might be hiding? Maybe the original owners, the ones who were involved in the ritual, maybe they left something behind. A record of what they did, a key to undoing it." The idea, though vague, offered a new direction, a tangible path to pursue. They decided to return to the rusty mug, not just as bartender and friend, but as investigators, searching for hidden clues within the very fabric of the building. Back at the bar, the atmosphere felt even heavier, more oppressive than before. The silence was thick, almost suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of the beer fridge and the creaks of the old building settling. The air seemed to vibrate with an unseen energy, a palpable sense of malevolence that made the hairs on Sarah's arms stand on end. "Where do we even start?" Mark asked, his voice low as he surveyed the familiar space, now imbued with a chilling new significance. Sarah looked around the bar, her gaze sweeping across the worn wooden surfaces, the scarred bar stools, the dusty bottles lining the shelves, trying to see it with fresh eyes, to perceive the hidden layers beneath the mundane facade. "The basement," she said suddenly, the idea striking her with a jolt of intuition. "The basement. Old buildings like this always have basements. I've never even been down there. The proprietor keeps it locked, says it's just storage. But what if it's more than that? What if it's connected to the original bar, to the ritual? The basement, a dark, unexplored space beneath the rusty mug, a potential repository of forgotten secrets." The idea was both terrifying and compelling. It felt like they were being drawn deeper and deeper into the heart of the mystery, into the entity's lair. They found the basement door tucked away in a dimly lit corner of the bar near the restrooms. It was a solid wooden door, reinforced with iron bands, a heavy padlock securing it shut. Sarah had never paid much attention to it before, dismissing it as just another part of the bar's aging infrastructure. Now it loomed before them, a gateway to the unknown. "Do you have the key?" Mark asked, his voice hushed with anticipation. Sarah shook her head. "The proprietor keeps all the keys. He's the only one who ever goes down there, as far as I know." "Then we'll have to find another way in," Mark said, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of apprehension and excitement. He examined the door, running his hands along the iron bands, testing the solidity of the wood. "This lock looks old but sturdy. We're not going to be able to pick it easily." "Maybe there's another entrance," Sarah suggested, her gaze sweeping around the bar, searching for alternatives. She remembered seeing a small, boarded-up window in the back alley near the dumpster. "There's a window in the alley. Maybe we can get in that way." They went outside, the cool night air a welcome contrast to the oppressive atmosphere of the bar. The back alley was narrow and dimly lit, smelling of stale beer and damp earth. The boarded-up window was exactly where Sarah remembered it, tucked away behind the dumpster, almost hidden from view. The boards were old and weathered, nailed haphazardly across the window frame. With a crowbar from the bar's maintenance closet, Mark carefully pried away the boards, the dry wood splintering and groaning in protest. Dust and cobwebs billowed out from the opening, mingling with the musty smell of the alley. Behind the boards, they found a small, grimy window, its glass thick and opaque with grime. Mark carefully shattered the window pane, the sound echoing sharply in the quiet alley, making Sarah jump. He reached inside, fumbling for the latch, and with a click, the window swung inwards, revealing a dark, narrow opening. The smell emanating from the basement was damp and earthy, tinged with a faint, metallic odor that made Sarah's stomach churn. "Ladies first," Mark said, gesturing towards the opening with a wry smile, his attempt at levity doing little to ease the tension that hung heavy in the air. Sarah hesitated for a moment, a wave of apprehension washing over her. Stepping into that dark, unknown space felt like stepping directly into the entity's domain. But the thought of turning back, of remaining trapped in the entity's game, was even more terrifying. Taking a deep breath, she squeezed through the narrow window opening, dropping down into the darkness below. Mark followed close behind, landing beside her with a soft thud. They were in the basement, plunged into absolute darkness, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. Sarah fumbled for her phone, switching on the flashlight function, the beam of light cutting through the inky blackness, revealing a small, cramped space, the low ceiling supported by thick wooden beams, the walls lined with rough-hewn stone. The basement was filled with forgotten remnants of the rusty mug's past. Dusty boxes were stacked against the walls, overflowing with old menus, faded photographs, and broken furniture. Cobwebs hung like macabre decorations from the beams and rafters, swaying gently in the still air. The floor was uneven, covered in a layer of damp earth and loose stones. As Sarah's eyes adjusted to the dim light, she noticed something else, something that sent a shiver down her spine. Etched into the stone walls, barely visible beneath layers of dust and grime, were symbols. Strange, archaic symbols, unlike anything she had ever seen before. Symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint, unsettling energy. "Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling, pointing her flashlight towards the wall. "Look at this." Mark moved closer, his own flashlight beam illuminating the symbols. His breath hitched in his throat. Those look like ritualistic symbols," he breathed, his voice hushed with awe and apprehension. "Like the ones mentioned in the folklore stories, the ones used in the binding ritual." The realization hit them both with the force of a physical blow. They weren't just in the basement of the rusty mug. They were in the heart of the entity's domain, in the very place where the original ritual had been performed, where the binding had been forged. And etched into the walls surrounding them were the symbols that had unleashed this malevolent force upon Havenwood. As they explored further into the basement, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, they discovered more disturbing details. In one corner, they found a circle drawn on the earthen floor, marked with more of the archaic symbols. The earth within the circle stained a dark, reddish-brown color that looked disturbingly like dried blood. In another corner, they found a small, wooden chest, its lid secured with a rusty latch. With trembling hands, Mark carefully opened the chest. Inside, nestled amongst layers of yellowed parchment, they found a leather-bound journal. Its cover was worn and cracked, the pages brittle and yellowed with age. As Sarah carefully opened the journal, the faint scent of old ink and dust wafted up from its pages. They had found it. The record of the ritual, the secrets of the entity, hidden beneath the rusty mug, waiting to be unearthed. The key, perhaps, to understanding, and to severing the entity's hold on Havenwood. The journal felt heavy in Sarah's hands, a physical manifestation of the weight of Havenwood's hidden history. Its leather cover was cracked and dry, the spine stiff with age, the pages within whispering promises of forgotten knowledge and untold secrets. A palpable stillness settled over the basement as they focused their attention on the fragile book, the beams of their flashlights converging on its worn surface. The air itself seemed to thicken, holding its breath in anticipation of the revelations to come. With a reverence bordering on fear, Sarah carefully opened the journal. The pages rustled like dry leaves, releasing a faint, musty scent that spoke of long years spent undisturbed in the darkness. The handwriting within was elegant, flowing script, faded brown ink bleeding slightly into the aged paper. It was the hand of someone accustomed to writing, someone educated, yet the words themselves carried an undercurrent of desperation, a sense of urgency that transcended the passage of time. The first few pages were filled with meticulous details about the planning of the ritual. Names were listed, prominent figures in Havenwood's history, men and women whose portraits still hung in the historical society, their faces gazing down with an air of solemn dignity that now seemed tainted by the knowledge of their secret pact. Dates were carefully noted, meetings documented, preparations described with a chilling precision. It was clear that this was not a spur-of-the-moment decision, but a carefully orchestrated undertaking, born out of desperation and a misguided belief in their own ability to control forces they could not possibly comprehend. As Sarah read aloud, her voice hushed and trembling slightly, Mark followed along, his own flashlight beam illuminating the pages over her shoulder. The journal detailed the hardships that had plagued Havenwood in the 1920s, the economic downturn, the crop failures, the wave of illness that had swept through the town, leaving grief and despair in its wake. It painted a picture of a community on the brink of collapse, desperate for salvation, willing to grasp at any hope, even if it meant venturing into dangerous and forbidden territory. "We gather not for personal gain, but for the salvation of our town," Sarah Reed, her voice echoing softly in the confined space of the basement. "Havenwood is withering, our people are suffering. We must act, we must draw upon the ancient power of this land to protect us, to restore our fortunes, to banish the darkness that has fallen upon us." Mark traced the words with his finger, his brow furrowed. "They genuinely believed they were doing the right thing," he murmured, a hint of pity in his voice. "They were desperate, misguided, but they thought they were saving Havenwood." "Desperation can be a dangerous thing," Sarah replied, her gaze fixed on the faded script, her voice tinged with a somber understanding. "It can blind you to the risks, make you believe you can control the uncontrollable." The journal went on to describe the selection of the ritual site, Old Oak Hill, the nexus point, the place where the veil between worlds was thin. It detailed the gathering of materials, ancient stones, herbs, candles, and finally, the most chilling element, the blood sacrifice, a willing offering meant to appease the ancient spirits and bind them to Havenwood's cause. "The oak will be our anchor, its roots deep in the earth, drawing power from the land itself," Sarah Reed, her voice barely above a whisper. "The symbols will be our guide, the incantations our binding words, and the offering will be our pact. A sacrifice willingly given to seal our agreement with the forces beyond, to ensure Havenwood's prosperity and protection for generations to come." Mark shuddered, his face pale in the flashlight beam. "A blood sacrifice," he repeated, his voice low with horror. They actually went through with it." The journal then described the ritual itself. The night of the binding, the gathering under the ancient oak, the chanting of incantations, the drawing of symbols in the earth, the spilling of blood onto the altar stone. The writing became more frantic, more feverish, reflecting the growing unease and fear that had gripped the participants as the ritual progressed. It spoke of strange winds that whipped through the trees, of shadows that danced and writhed in the flickering candlelight, of voices that seemed to whisper from the darkness, voices that were not their own. "The air grew cold, colder than any winter night," Sarah Reed, her voice trembling. "The flames flickered and danced, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to mock our sacred purpose. The ground beneath our feet trembled and a sound arose from the earth, a low, guttural moan that chilled us to the bone. We pressed on, driven by fear and desperation, chanting the incantations, pouring the offering, believing we were on the verge of success, of securing Havenwood's salvation." But then the tone of the journal shifted again, descending into chaos and terror. The writing became erratic, almost illegible, the words scratched out and rewritten, filled with exclamations and frantic pleas. It described the moment when the ritual went wrong, when the binding snapped, when the entity they had sought to control turned against them, unleashing its malevolence upon Havenwood. "The circle broke, the symbols shattered, the incantations twisted in our mouths," Sarah continued, her voice choked with emotion. "The offering was rejected, scorned, and in its place something else answered our call. Something dark, something ancient, something hungry. It rose from the earth, a shadow-given form, a whisper made flesh, and its eyes were like empty voids, staring into our souls, promising only pain and despair." The journal described the entity's emergence, its terrifying presence, its immediate and devastating impact on the ritual participants. It spoke of madness, illness, and unexplained deaths that followed in the wake of the failed binding, of a pervasive sense of dread that settled over Havenwood, a darkness that clung to the town like a shroud. "We had sought to bind a force for good, but we had unleashed a monster," Sarah Reed, her voice barely audible, tears welling up in her eyes. "We had sought to protect Havenwood, but we had doomed it. And now we are paying the price, all of us. The entity is here, it is bound to this land, and it feeds on our sorrow, our despair, our fear. There is no escape, no redemption. Only darkness awaits us all." The final pages of the journal were almost completely illegible, filled with frantic scribbles, incoherent ramblings, and desperate prayers. The last entry was simply a single word, scrawled in a shaky hand, filled with a chilling finality: "Doomed." Silence descended upon the basement once more, heavy and oppressive, broken only by Sarah's ragged breaths and the faint drip of water somewhere in the darkness. The weight of the journal's revelations pressed down on them, suffocating them with the knowledge of Havenwood's dark secret, of the entity's origin, of the terrible mistake made by their ancestors. Mark reached out, his hand gently covering Sarah's, his touch grounding her in the present moment, pulling her back from the abyss of despair that threatened to engulf her. "Sarah," he said softly, his voice filled with compassion, "I'm so sorry. This is terrible." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed, tears streaming down her face. "It's all our fault, Mark," she whispered, her voice choked with guilt and despair. "Havenwood, this is our legacy. This entity, it's our fault it's here." "No, Sarah, it's not your fault," Mark said firmly, his grip tightening on her hand. "It's the fault of those people, those misguided souls who performed that ritual. They made a terrible mistake, but we can't let their mistake define us. We have to fix it. We have to find a way to undo what they did, to break the binding, to banish the entity." His words, though filled with resolve, sounded hollow even to his own ears. The task ahead seemed insurmountable, the entity's power so vast, its influence so deeply entrenched in Havenwood's fabric. But they couldn't afford to succumb to despair. They had to cling to hope, to fight back, even if the odds seemed stacked against them. They continued to examine the journal, searching for any hint of a solution, any clue that might help them break the binding. The journal itself offered little in the way of answers, only a detailed account of the ritual, the entity's emergence, and the subsequent descent into despair. But within the descriptions of the ritual, within the frantic scribbles and incoherent ramblings, they began to notice recurring themes, repeated symbols, fragmented phrases that seemed to carry a deeper significance. "Look at this," Mark said, pointing to a section of the journal where the writer had described the symbols used in the ritual. He compared the drawings in the journal to the symbols etched on the basement walls, his brow furrowing in concentration. "These symbols, they're not just random markings. They're part of a system, a language almost, and they seem to be inverted, like they're meant to contain something, to trap something." Sarah leaned closer, her gaze fixed on the symbols, her mind racing. "Inverted," she repeated, her voice thoughtful. "What do you mean?" "Look," Mark explained, tracing the lines of a particular symbol with his finger. "This symbol here, in its normal form, it represents protection, warding off evil. But here, in the ritual circle, it's drawn upside down, reversed. It's like they twisted the symbols, turned them against themselves, to create a binding instead of a ward." A spark of understanding ignited in Sarah's mind. "So, to break the binding," she said, her voice gaining a flicker of hope, "we need to reverse the symbols again, put them back in their original form." Mark nodded slowly, his eyes shining with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. "It's just a theory, but it makes sense, doesn't it? If they used inverted symbols to create the binding, maybe we can use the correct symbols to undo it." The idea was risky, audacious, bordering on insane. But it was the only lead they had, the only glimmer of hope in the encroaching darkness. They had to try. They had to believe that they could undo the mistakes of the past, that they could break the entity's hold on Havenwood, that they could silence the whispers from the past and reclaim their town from the shadows. They spent the rest of the night in the basement, poring over the journal, deciphering the archaic symbols, and comparing them to the markings on the walls. Mark, with his knowledge of local history and folklore, recognized some of the symbols from old texts and regional legends, piecing together their meanings, their origins, their potential power. Sarah, meanwhile, focused on the emotional resonance of the symbols, the feeling they evoked within her, trusting her intuition to guide them through the labyrinth of ancient knowledge. As dawn approached, painting the sky with the first streaks of light, they emerged from the basement, exhausted but energized, their minds buzzing with a newfound purpose. They had a plan, a risky, desperate plan, but a plan nonetheless. They would return to the basement, to the ritual circle, and they would attempt to reverse the symbols, to undo the binding, to banish the entity back to the shadows from whence it came. The task ahead was daunting, fraught with peril, but they were no longer just helpless witnesses to the entity's game. They were players now, taking the fight to the heart of the darkness, armed with knowledge, with courage, and with a desperate hope that they could change what was destined, that they could rewrite Havenwood's fate, starting with the secrets hidden deep beneath the rusty mug. The first rays of sunrise touched the sleepy town, but for Sarah and Mark, the night was far from over, and the true battle was only just beginning. A battle against shadows, whispers, and an entity that had claimed Havenwood as its own. A battle that would determine not only their own fates, but the fate of the entire town, a battle fought in the heart of the rusty mug, where the echoes of the past intertwined with the terrors of the present, and the future hung precariously in the balance, waiting to be written. The first rays of dawn, weak and watery, barely pierced the grimy basement window as Sarah and Mark ascended the rickety wooden stairs back into the rusty mug. The bar above was shrouded in a pre-dawn gloom, the silence heavy and expectant. The weight of the journal, the chilling revelations of Havenwood's past, and the daunting task ahead settled heavily upon them. Yet beneath the exhaustion and fear, a fragile core of resolve had solidified. They had a plan, however desperate, and a purpose, however terrifying. They moved through the silent bar, the familiar space now feeling alien and menacing in the early morning light. Dust motes danced in the faint beams filtering through the windows, each particle seeming to shimmer with an unseen energy, a residue of the entity's pervasive influence. The air itself felt thick, charged, as if the very wood and stone of the rusty mug were vibrating with a malevolent hum. "We need to gather some things," Mark said, his voice low, breaking the oppressive silence. From the journal, it mentioned specific herbs, candles, and chalk, to redraw the symbols to reverse the binding. Sarah nodded, her mind still racing, piecing together the fragmented details from the journal, trying to recall every symbol, every incantation, every whispered warning. "And we need to be careful," she added, her voice barely above a whisper. "The entity, it knows what we're doing. It's going to fight back." They worked quickly and silently, moving through the bar like shadows, gathering the necessary items. Sarah found beeswax candles behind the bar, remnants from a long-forgotten power outage. Mark rummaged in the dusty storage room, unearthing a box of white chalk and a collection of dried herbs, likely used for some forgotten bar concoction or local remedy. The air was thick with anticipation, each creak of the floorboards, each rustle of paper, sounding amplified in the tense silence. As they prepared to descend back into the basement, Sarah glanced at the security monitor in the office. The screen flickered with static, the camera feeds distorted and grainy, the audio a garbled mess of overlapping voices, almost unintelligible. The entity's presence was growing stronger, its influence pushing back against their intrusion, distorting the very technology they had used to uncover its secrets. Taking a deep breath, Sarah led the way back down the creaking basement stairs, Mark following close behind, their flashlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. The basement air felt colder, heavier than before, the damp earth smell tinged with a metallic tang that made Sarah's nostrils sting. The symbols etched on the stone walls seemed to pulse with a more vibrant energy, their archaic forms seeming to writhe and shift in the flickering flashlight beams. They returned to the ritual circle, the dark stain on the earthen floor seeming darker, more ominous in the dim light. The air within the circle felt charged, heavy with an unseen presence, making Sarah's skin prickle with unease. Mark carefully laid out the chalk, the candles, and the herbs, arranging them according to the instructions they had gleaned from the journal, his movements deliberate and precise. "Okay," Mark said, his voice hushed, breaking the silence. "According to the journal, we need to redraw the symbols within the circle, but in their correct, uninverted forms. And then we need to perform a counter-incantation, a reversal of the original binding words." Sarah nodded, her heart pounding in her chest, fear and determination warring within her. "And the candles and herbs?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The candles are to create a protective barrier to contain the energy," Mark explained, his gaze fixed on the symbols etched on the wall. "And the herbs, they're supposed to purify the space, to cleanse it of the entity's influence." He began to redraw the symbols within the circle, his hand trembling slightly as he carefully traced the chalk lines onto the earthen floor. Sarah watched him, her breath held captive in her lungs, the silence broken only by the soft scratching of chalk on dirt and the frantic beating of her heart. Each symbol he redrew felt like a step deeper into the unknown, a step closer to either salvation or utter destruction. As Mark completed the first symbol, a faint tremor ran through the basement, the air growing colder still. the shadows deepening in the corners of the cramped space. The whispers, which had been a constant, subtle undercurrent, suddenly intensified, swelling in volume, becoming more distinct, more menacing. The overlapping voices swirled around them, no longer just fragmented snippets of past conversations, but coherent phrases, directed at them, accusatory, threatening. "Foolish mortals, you dare to interfere with what is ordained." The voice was deeper, colder than any they had heard before, resonating with a power that seemed to shake the very foundations of the rusty mug. The candlelight flickered violently, casting grotesque shadows that danced and writhed on the basement walls, mimicking the distorted symbols etched in the stone. Sarah felt a wave of nausea wash over her, a dizzying sense of disorientation, as if the very fabric of reality was beginning to unravel around them. The air grew thick with a palpable sense of dread, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The entity was aware of their actions, it was resisting, and its power was growing. "Keep going, Mark," Sarah urged, her voice strained, trying to push back against the rising tide of fear. "Don't stop, we have to finish this." Mark nodded, his face pale but determined, his hand moving faster now, his chalk strokes becoming more hurried, more desperate. He completed the next symbol, and another tremor shook the basement, more violent this time, dust and pebbles raining down from the low ceiling. The whispers intensified further, becoming a deafening cacophony of voices, swirling around them, assaulting their senses, trying to break their resolve. Objects in the bar above began to move on their own. Glasses rattled on the shelves, bottles swayed precariously, bar stools scraped against the wooden floor, creating a chaotic symphony of unsettling sounds that echoed down into the basement, amplifying the sense of impending chaos. The flickering bar lights pulsed erratically, casting strobing shadows that danced and flickered, plunging the rusty mug into a nightmarish dance of light and darkness. Upstairs in the main bar area, a few early risers, drawn by the promise of a strong drink and a familiar refuge, began to trickle into the rusty mug, oblivious to the unseen forces at play, unaware of the ancient battle raging beneath their feet. They entered the bar, expecting the usual quiet solace of a weekday morning, but they were met with a scene of unsettling disarray. The bar lights flickered erratically, casting strange shadows that danced and shifted, making the familiar space feel alien and menacing. Objects seemed to move on their own, coasters skittered across the bar, napkins fluttered in a non-existent breeze, and the jukebox in the corner suddenly sputtered to life, blaring out a discordant melody of overlapping tunes, a chaotic mix of jazz and blues and country twang, all playing at once, creating a jarring, unsettling cacophony. The patrons exchanged uneasy glances, a sense of unease creeping into their initial confusion. The usual comforting atmosphere of the rusty mug had vanished, replaced by a palpable tension, a feeling that something was wrong, deeply wrong. The air felt heavy, charged with an unseen energy, making their skin prickle with apprehension. Then the whispers began, faint at first, almost imperceptible like a murmur on the edge of hearing. But they grew louder, more insistent, swirling around them, weaving through the discordant music, intruding into their thoughts, filling the bar with an unsettling cacophony of voices. Overlapping voices, speaking in different tones, different accents, different eras, all at once, creating a confusing, disorienting soundscape. The patrons started to react, their initial unease morphing into confusion, then into fear. They looked around, searching for the source of the voices, their eyes darting nervously from corner to corner, but there was no one there, just the empty bar, the flickering lights, and the unsettling sounds. "What's going on?" one patron whispered, his voice trembling slightly, looking around with wide eyes. "Did anyone else hear that?" "Hear what?" another patron replied, his voice strained. That noise, it sounds like voices. But where are they coming from?" The whispers grew louder still, becoming more menacing, more accusatory. The overlapping voices seemed to coalesce into coherent phrases, directed at the patrons, targeting their deepest fears, their hidden anxieties, their unspoken sorrows. "You are not safe here, this place is cursed, leave before it's too late." The patrons' fear escalated into panic. They started to back away from the bar, their faces pale, their eyes wide with terror. The chaotic music from the jukebox intensified, the flickering lights pulsed faster, and objects began to move more violently. Glasses shattered, Bottles crashed to the floor, bar stools overturned, the rusty mug descending into chaos. "We have to get out of here," one patron screamed, his voice cracking with fear, pushing his way towards the door. "This place it's haunted." The patrons surged towards the exit, a chaotic mass of terrified humanity, pushing and shoving, desperate to escape the terrifying atmosphere of the rusty mug. The bar, once a haven, a refuge, had become a trap, a place of fear and dread, consumed by the entity's malevolent influence. Back in the basement, Mark completed the final symbol, his hand shaking, his face drenched in sweat. As the last chalk line connected, a blinding flash of light erupted from the circle, followed by a deafening roar that echoed through the rusty mug, shaking the very foundations of the building. The whispers abruptly ceased, the chaotic music from above cut off mid-discord, the flickering lights steadied, and the moving objects stilled. A profound silence descended upon the basement, a silence so deep, so absolute it felt almost tangible, pressing down on Sarah and Mark, making their ears ring. The air, which had been thick with dread, now felt strangely clear, almost cleansed. The symbols etched on the walls seemed to dim, their unsettling energy fading, their archaic forms becoming less distinct, less menacing. Sarah and Mark stared at each other, their faces pale, their eyes wide with a mixture of exhaustion, awe, and a hesitant, fragile hope. Had they done it? Had they reversed the binding? Had they banished the entity? Or was this just a brief respite, a temporary lull in the storm, before the entity unleashed its full fury upon them in Havenwood? The silence stretched, heavy with unanswered questions, pregnant with an uncertain future. The first rays of true dawn finally pierced the grimy basement window, casting a pale, hopeful light into the darkness, illuminating the chalk circle, the reversed symbols, and the two figures standing within, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and trepidation, waiting, listening for any sign, any whisper, any indication of what the dawn would truly bring to the rusty mug and to Havenwood itself. The air remained still, the silence unbroken, but a subtle shift, a barely perceptible change in the atmosphere, hinted that the battle was far from over, that the echoes of the past and the shadows of the entity still lingered, waiting in the wings, poised to return. The silence in the basement was profound, a stark contrast to the chaotic symphony of moments before. It pressed against Sarah and Mark, a tangible weight, yet within it there was a subtle shift, a sense of lightness, of release that had been absent for days, perhaps even weeks. The oppressive dread that had clung to the air had dissipated, replaced by a tentative calm like the eye of a storm. Sarah and Mark remained motionless within the chalk circle, their breath held, their senses straining for any sign, any echo of the entity's presence. The candlelight flickered softly, steadily now, no longer dancing to an unseen malevolent rhythm. The symbols etched on the walls seemed less vibrant, their archaic forms less defined, as if their power, their connection to the entity, had been severed. Slowly, cautiously, Mark lowered his hand, the chalk dust clinging to his fingers. He looked at Sarah, his eyes searching hers for confirmation, for reassurance. Did it work?" he whispered, his voice raspy, barely audible in the stillness. Sarah let out a shaky breath, a hesitant smile flickering across her lips. I think so," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "It feels different, lighter." She stepped out of the circle, her movements tentative, her gaze sweeping across the basement, searching for any sign of the entity's lingering presence. The shadows remained, but they seemed less menacing, less alive. The air, though still damp and earthy, felt cleaner, devoid of the oppressive weight that had been suffocating them. Mark followed her out of the circle, his own movements cautious, his senses on high alert. He sniffed the air, his brow furrowed in concentration. "It's cleaner somehow," he agreed, his voice tinged with wonder, "like the air has been purified." They moved around the basement, their flashlights illuminating the corners and crevices of the cramped space, searching for any lingering signs of the entity's influence. The ritual circle remained, the chalk lines stark against the earthen floor, the inverted symbols now replaced by their corrected forms, radiating a subtle, almost imperceptible energy that felt different. Not menacing, but balanced, harmonious. They found nothing else, no sign of the entity, no lingering whispers, no oppressive dread. The basement, once a place of fear and foreboding, now felt just like a basement. Damp, dusty, and filled with forgotten relics, but devoid of the malevolent presence that had haunted it for decades. A wave of exhaustion washed over Sarah, so profound it almost buckled her knees. The adrenaline that had propelled her through the past few days, the fear and desperation that had fueled her actions, finally began to recede, leaving behind a profound weariness, both physical and emotional. She leaned against a damp stone wall, closing her eyes, letting out a long, shuddering sigh. Mark placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle and reassuring. "Sarah, are you all right?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "You look completely drained." Sarah opened her eyes, forcing a weak smile. "I think I'm okay," she said, her voice hoarse. "Just tired, really, really tired." She looked around the basement again, her gaze lingering on the ritual circle, on the reversed symbols, on the dusty walls that had borne witness to Havenwood's dark history. "Did we really do it, Mark?" she whispered, her voice filled with a fragile hope. "Did we actually banish it?" Mark squeezed her shoulder gently. "I think we did, Sarah," he said, his voice firm, his eyes shining with a quiet triumph. I think we actually saved Havenwood." They ascended the basement stairs once more, emerging back into the rusty mug, their senses adjusting to the relative brightness and the lingering echoes of the chaos that had erupted moments before. The bar was eerily silent, still, and strangely empty. The flickering lights were steady now, casting a warm, inviting glow across the familiar space. The overturned bar stools had righted themselves, the shattered glass and spilled liquor had vanished. The jukebox stood silently in the corner, its discordant melody silenced. It was as if the chaotic outburst had never happened, as if the entity's final, desperate attempt to assert its power had been erased, leaving behind only a pristine, almost unnervingly calm bar, except for the absence of patrons. The rusty mug was deserted, save for Sarah and Mark. The terrified patrons had fled, leaving behind an empty space, a vacuum where the usual convivial buzz of the bar should have been. Sarah walked behind the bar, her movements slow, her gaze sweeping across the empty stools, the untouched glasses, the silent taps. It felt strange, unsettling to see the rusty mug so devoid of life, so utterly still. The bar had always been a place of noise, of chatter, of laughter, even of sorrow and arguments, but never this silent. Mark moved to the front door, peering out into the street. "It's deserted out there too," he said, turning back to Sarah, his brow furrowed with concern. Like everyone in Havenwood just vanished. A new wave of unease washed over Sarah. The silence in the bar, which had initially felt like a welcome respite, now seemed ominous, too complete, too unnatural. Had the entity truly been banished, or had it simply retreated? Gone silent, gathering its strength, preparing for another, more devastating attack. And what about the patrons who had fled the bar? Where had they gone? Had they escaped the entity's influence? Or had they carried its fear, its dread with them, spreading it throughout Havenwood, infecting the entire town with its malevolence? "We need to check outside," Sarah said, her voice regaining a note of urgency. "We need to see what's happening in Havenwood. We need to make sure everyone's all right." They stepped out of the rusty mug, emerging into the pale morning light. Havenwood was indeed deserted, eerily so. Main Street, usually bustling with early morning activity, was completely empty. No cars moved, no people walked, no sounds of life filled the air. The silence was absolute, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves in the trees and the distant crowing of a rooster, sounds that only served to amplify the unsettling stillness of the town. Storefronts were dark, doors were closed, windows were shuttered. The Havenwood diner, usually bustling with breakfast patrons, was silent and dark, its neon sign unlit. The Havenwood Historical Society, Mark's usual domain, stood locked and empty, its dusty windows reflecting the pale morning light. The entire town seemed to be holding its breath, waiting, watching, shrouded in an unnatural, oppressive silence. "Where is everyone?" Sarah whispered, her voice filled with a growing dread, her gaze sweeping across the deserted street, searching for any sign of life. "Where did they all go?" Mark shook his head, his face pale, his eyes wide with alarm. "I don't know," he said, his voice barely audible. "It's like Havenwood is a ghost town." They walked down Main Street, their footsteps echoing eerily in the silence, their voices hushed, their senses on high alert. They called out, their voices swallowed by the stillness, unanswered. They knocked on doors, their knuckles rapping against the silent wood unheard. Havenwood remained deserted, unresponsive, locked in an unnerving silence that spoke of something far more profound than just a town still asleep. As they walked, Sarah noticed something else, something that sent a shiver of ice down her spine. The shadows, even in the pale morning light, seemed longer, darker, more distorted than they should be. They stretched and writhed, clinging to the buildings, to the trees, to the very ground beneath their feet, a subtle but unmistakable echo of the entity's lingering presence. The shadows, they lengthen for you. The chilling words echoed in her mind, a haunting reminder that the battle was far from over, that the entity, even if banished from the rusty mug, still held a grip on Havenwood, its influence woven into the very fabric of the town, its shadows still lengthening, still reaching. The silence of Havenwood was not peaceful, not restful. It was a silence pregnant with unease, with a sense of waiting dread. It was the silence of a town holding its breath, anticipating a blow yet to fall, a silence that whispered of a darkness that had not been vanquished but merely paused. And Sarah knew with a chilling certainty that the dawn had not brought an end to the nightmare. It had only marked the beginning of a new, and perhaps even more terrifying, chapter in Havenwood's long, shadowed history. The echoes of the past and the shadows of the entity were still there, lingering, waiting, and the future of Havenwood, and of Sarah herself, remained shrouded in a veil of unsettling uncertainty. The silence of Havenwood was not peaceful, not restful. It was a silence pregnant with unease, with a sense of waiting dread. It was the silence of a town holding its breath, anticipating a blow yet to fall, a silence that whispered of a darkness that had not been vanquished but merely paused. And Sarah knew with a chilling certainty that the dawn had not brought an end to the nightmare. It had only marked the beginning of a new, and perhaps even more terrifying, chapter in Havenwood's long, shadowed history. The echoes of the past and the shadows of the entity were still there, lingering, waiting, and the future of Havenwood, and of Sarah herself, remained shrouded in a veil of unsettling uncertainty. "It's like something out of a horror movie," Mark muttered, his voice echoing unnaturally loud in the deserted street, breaking the oppressive silence. He ran a hand through his hair, his gaze sweeping across the empty storefronts, his expression a mixture of disbelief and growing fear. Where could everyone have gone? It's not like the whole town just decided to take a spontaneous vacation. Sarah shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her, though the morning air was not particularly cold. It was the coldness within her, the icy tendrils of dread that had wrapped themselves around her heart, that made her feel chilled to the bone. "I don't know, Mark," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But it doesn't feel right. It feels like they were all taken." "Taken?" Mark repeated, his voice laced with skepticism but also a hint of unease. "Taken where, Sarah? By what?" "By it," Sarah said, the word catching in her throat, unable to bring herself to name the entity aloud, as if even whispering its name might invite its attention, its malevolence. "By the entity. Maybe it's not banished. Maybe reversing the symbols, maybe it just angered it." But the basement felt different, Mark argued, his brow furrowed in thought. It felt cleansed, the symbols they were working, I could feel it. "Maybe we only pushed it back," Sarah countered, her voice filled with doubt. "Maybe we only created a temporary reprieve, and now it's retaliating, taking Havenwood hostage." They continued walking down Main Street, their footsteps echoing eerily in the silence, their eyes scanning the deserted buildings, searching for any sign of life, any clue to the town's sudden disappearance. They passed the Havenwood diner, its windows dark and lifeless, the cheerful neon sign unlit, a stark contrast to its usual welcoming glow. They reached the Havenwood Historical Society, Mark's sanctuary, now locked and empty, its dusty windows reflecting their own pale, worried faces. As they stood in front of the Historical Society, a sudden thought struck Sarah, a memory flickering in her mind, a detail from the journal that she had almost overlooked in the frantic rush to decipher the symbols and prepare for the count ritual. "The watch," she said suddenly, her voice sharp with realization. The journal mentioned a watch as a focal point for the original ritual. They used it to bind the entity. Mark's eyes widened, his expression shifting from concern to a spark of renewed hope. "The proprietor's watch," he breathed, his voice filled with excitement. "The antique pocket watch. You said he always kept it locked away in a special case." Yes, Sarah replied, her mind racing, piecing together the fragments of information. He said it was an heirloom, something valuable, but maybe it's more than just an heirloom. Maybe it's still connected to the entity. Maybe it's still a focal point. If it was used in the original ritual, Mark reasoned, his voice gaining momentum, then maybe we can use it to reverse the ritual completely, to sever the entity's connection to Havenwood once and for all. A fragile hope flickered within Sarah's weary heart, a desperate grasp at a possible solution, a chance to truly banish the entity and restore Havenwood to its former self. But how do we get it? She asked, her voice tinged with doubt. The proprietor keeps it locked away. We don't have the key, and even if we did, where would it be? The office, Mark said, his voice firm. The proprietor's office. That's where he keeps everything locked up. The safe, the important documents, probably the watch too. The proprietor's office. A small, cramped space in the back of the rusty mug, usually off limits, shrouded in an air of mystery and secrecy. Sarah had only been inside a few times to drop off paperwork or retrieve supplies, always feeling a sense of unease, a feeling that she was intruding on something private, something hidden. Now it loomed in her mind as a potential treasure trove of answers, a gateway to breaking the entity's hold on Havenwood. They turned back towards the rusty mug, their footsteps quickening, their hearts pounding with a mixture of hope and trepidation. The bar, once a place of fear, now held the promise of salvation, the key to undoing the darkness that had engulfed their town. Back inside the rusty mug, they moved directly to the office, the small, cramped space feeling even more claustrophobic than usual in the deserted bar. The security monitor flickered with static, the camera feed still distorted, the audio a garbled mess of whispers and static. The entity's presence still lingered, a subtle undercurrent of unease that permeated the air, a reminder that their victory in the basement might be only temporary. The proprietor's office door was locked, as always. Sarah had never had a key, relying on the proprietor's cryptic notes and infrequent appearances to guide her management of the bar. But now, the locked door felt like a barrier, a final obstacle standing between them and a potential solution. "We need to get in there," Mark said, his voice determined, examining the door, testing the handle, the lock. "It's a simple bolt lock. I think I can pick it." Mark, despite his scholarly demeanor, possessed a surprising array of practical skills, honed by years of exploring Havenwood's hidden corners and forgotten places. He pulled out a small, slim tool from his pocket, a lock pick set he had acquired for his amateur locksmithing hobby. He knelt down in front of the door, his brow furrowed in concentration, his fingers moving deftly, inserting the picks into the lock, manipulating the tumblers with a practiced ease. Sarah watched him, her breath held, her heart pounding in her chest, the silence of the bar amplifying the delicate clicks and scrapes of the lock picks. Minutes stretched into an eternity, each second filled with a mounting tension, a desperate hope that Mark would succeed, that they would find the watch, that they could still salvage Havenwood from the brink of despair. Finally, with a soft click, the lock disengaged. Mark straightened up, a triumphant grin spreading across his face. "Got it," he whispered, pushing open the door, revealing the dimly lit interior of the proprietor's office. The office was small, cramped, and cluttered, filled with stacks of papers, dusty boxes, and forgotten relics of the rusty mug's long history. A heavy wooden desk dominated the center of the room, its surface piled high with ledgers, receipts, and cryptic notes in the proprietor's distinctive scrawling handwriting. A small, antique safe stood in the corner, its steel door gleaming dully in the dim light, its combination lock a silent sentinel guarding its secrets. The safe, Sarah breathed, her gaze fixed on the steel box, a sense of both anticipation and dread washing over her. The watch must be in the safe. They moved towards the safe, their footsteps echoing softly in the confined space, the air thick with the scent of old paper and dust. Mark examined the combination lock, his brow furrowed in concentration. "This is going to be trickier," he muttered, running his fingers over the dial. "It's an old rotary lock, probably hasn't been opened in years. We're going to need to crack the combination." Cracking a safe combination was a skill beyond Mark's amateur locksmithing abilities. But they were running out of time, out of options. They had to try. They had to believe that they could find a way, that they could overcome this final obstacle, that they could reclaim Havenwood from the shadows. They began searching the office, frantically sifting through the piles of papers, the dusty boxes, the cluttered drawers, searching for any clue, any hint of the safe combination, any record that might help them unlock the secrets within. They found old receipts, faded photographs, cryptic notes, but no combination, no key, no obvious solution. As they searched, the whispers began again, fainter than before, but undeniably present, a subtle undercurrent of malevolence weaving its way through the silence of the office. The overlapping voices murmured fragments of warnings, taunts, and chilling pronouncements, their insidious influence seeping back into the rusty mug, a reminder that the entity was still there, still watching, still waiting. Sarah felt a growing sense of desperation, a fear that time was running out, that the entity was regaining its strength, that Havenwood was slipping further and further into its grasp. They had to find the watch, they had to attempt the ritual, they had to act before it was too late. Suddenly, as she was rummaging through a dusty box filled with old bar menus, her fingers brushed against something small, cold, and metallic. She pulled it out, her heart leaping in her chest. It was a small, tarnished silver key, intricately carved, unlike any key she had ever seen before. And attached to the key by a delicate silver chain was a small, folded piece of paper, yellowed and brittle with age. With trembling hands, Sarah unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the faded ink, her breath catching in her throat. It was a combination, a series of numbers, scrawled in the proprietor's distinctive handwriting, labeled simply, "Watch Safe." Hope surged through Sarah, a wave of adrenaline washing away the exhaustion and despair, replacing it with a renewed sense of purpose, a desperate surge of energy. They had found it. The key, the combination, the final pieces of the puzzle falling into place, guiding them towards a potential salvation. "Mark," she said, her voice trembling with excitement, holding up the key and the combination. "I found it. I found the key to the safe, and the combination." Mark's face lit up, his eyes widening with disbelief and elation. "You did it, Sarah," he exclaimed, his voice filled with relief and triumph. "You actually did it. Let's open that safe and get that watch." With trembling hands, Mark inserted the key into the safe lock, turning it gently, feeling the tumblers click into place. Then he carefully dialed the combination, his fingers moving slowly, deliberately, following the faded numbers on the brittle piece of paper. Each click of the dial echoed loudly in the tense silence of the office, each number bringing them closer to the unknown, closer to a potential confrontation with the entity, closer to either salvation or utter destruction. Finally, with a resounding click, the safe door unlocked. Mark grasped the heavy handle, his breath held, and pulled the door open, revealing the dark interior of the safe. And there, nestled on a velvet cushion, bathed in the pale morning light filtering through the office window, lay the proprietor's antique pocket watch. Gleaming silver, intricately engraved, pulsing with an unseen energy, the focal point of a ritual, the key to Havenwood's past and perhaps to its future. The watch lay nestled on the velvet cushion, bathed in the pale morning light, an object of both beauty and ominous power. Its silver casing gleamed, intricately engraved with patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in the light, hinting at the unseen forces contained within. As Sarah reached for it, a sudden gust of cold wind swept through the office, slamming the door shut with a resounding bang, plunging the room into shadow. The whispers intensified, swelling into a deafening roar, the overlapping voices coalescing into a single, chilling pronouncement. "You meddle in things you cannot comprehend." Sarah froze, her hand hovering inches from the watch, a wave of icy dread washing over her. The air crackled with unseen energy, the shadows in the office deepening, twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to writhe and reach for them. The entity's presence was no longer subtle, no longer a whisper on the edge of hearing. It was here in the office, in the rusty mug, unleashing its full power, anticipating their move, preparing to crush their desperate attempt to break free. "Sarah, don't!" Mark cried, his voice strained with terror, pulling her back from the safe, away from the watch, as if the very object emanated a palpable danger. "It's a trap, it knows what we're doing." But it was too late. As Mark pulled her back, a blinding flash of light erupted from the watch, engulfing the office, searing Sarah's vision, sending a shockwave of energy that threw them both backwards, slamming them against the opposite wall. The whispers became a deafening shriek, a cacophony of voices screaming in unison, a sound that tore through their minds, shattering their thoughts, plunging them into a vortex of chaos and disorientation. Then, as suddenly as it began, the light vanished, the roar subsided, the whispers faded into silence. The office was plunged back into shadow, the air thick with the smell of ozone and a lingering sense of unease. Sarah lay on the floor, disoriented, her head spinning, her ears ringing, her vision blurred. Mark lay beside her, equally dazed, his breathing ragged, his eyes wide with terror. Slowly, painfully, Sarah pushed herself up, her body aching, her head throbbing. She blinked, her vision gradually clearing, her gaze sweeping across the office, searching for Mark, for the watch, for any sign of what had just transpired. Mark was sitting up, rubbing his head, his expression dazed and confused. The watch was gone. The safe door stood open, empty, the velvet cushion now bare. The office itself seemed different, subtly, almost imperceptibly different. "Mark," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse, her mind struggling to make sense of what had happened. What was that? Where's the watch?" Mark shook his head, his brow furrowed in confusion. "I don't know," he mumbled, his voice thick with disorientation. It just vanished, after the flash, it's gone." He looked around the office, his gaze lingering on the piles of papers, the dusty boxes, the familiar clutter. "And something's wrong, Sarah, something feels off." Sarah looked around the office again, her senses sharpening, her mind beginning to piece together the subtle shifts, the almost imperceptible changes that had occurred in the aftermath of the flash. The air felt heavier, thicker, more oppressive than before. The shadows seemed to deepen, to lengthen, to writhe with an unseen energy. And the whispers. They were back, fainter now, but undeniably present, weaving their way through the silence, not as a cacophony of voices, but as a single, chilling phrase, repeating over and over, echoing in her mind, in the office, in the very fabric of the rusty mug. Again and again and again. The phrase echoed, relentless, inescapable, a chilling pronouncement, a terrifying revelation. Sarah's blood ran cold, a wave of icy dread washing over her as the true horror of their situation began to dawn on her. The entity hadn't been banished, hadn't been thwarted. It had anticipated their move. It had used the watch not as a focal point for their counter-ritual, but as a weapon, as a tool to unleash its full power, to trap them, not in the rusty mug, not in Havenwood, but in something far more insidious, far more terrifying. Again and again and again. The phrase echoed, relentless, inescapable, and as Sarah looked at Mark, his face etched with confusion and dawning horror, she saw it in his eyes, the same chilling realization reflected back at her. They weren't just trapped in the rusty mug, trapped in Havenwood, trapped by the entity. They were trapped in time itself, trapped in a temporal loop orchestrated by the entity, forced to relive something, some event, some tragedy over and over again for eternity. And the phrase, again and again and again, was not just a chilling pronouncement, it was a promise. A promise of endless repetition, of inescapable reliving, of eternal torment, orchestrated by the entity, designed to break them, to consume them, to feed on their sorrow, their despair, their fear for all eternity. The office door creaked open, revealing the main bar area beyond. Sarah and Mark turned, their eyes widening in disbelief, in horror, in a dawning understanding of the entity's cruel design. Emerging from the bar, shuffling slowly, deliberately towards the office, was old man Fitzwilliam, his face contorted in pain, his hand clutching his leg, a dark stain spreading across his trousers. Behind him, the shelf of liquor bottles stood intact, fully stocked, gleaming in the bar lights, not a single bottle broken, not a single glass shard on the floor. The scene was a perfect replica of the moment of Fitzwilliam's accident, the moment of tragedy, the moment that had marked the beginning of their desperate attempt to intervene, to change fate. The moment that was now, impossibly, repeating itself. Again and again and again. The phrase echoed in Sarah's mind, relentless, inescapable, as Fitzwilliam groaned, his voice weak and strained, repeating the same words he had uttered before, the words that had sent Sarah and Mark spiraling into their desperate quest to save Havenwood. Shelf came down out of nowhere, leg. Think it's broken. Time had reset, the entity had trapped them, and their torment, their endless reliving of past tragedies and failures had only just begun. The rusty mug, once a haven, now a prison, a stage for their eternal torment, a temporal loop designed to break their spirits, to feed the entity's insatiable hunger for sorrow and despair. And as Fitzwilliam slumped against the wall, repeating his lines, Sarah knew, with a chilling certainty, that they were trapped, truly trapped, in a nightmare from which there was no waking, doomed to relive the horrors of the past again and again and again. Again and again and again. The chilling phrase reverberated in the suddenly quiet bar, a malevolent echo that resonated not just in the air, but within the very bones of Sarah and Mark. Fitzwilliam's groan, the same pained sound that had ignited their desperate quest, hung heavy in the air. Sarah stared, transfixed by the unfolding scene, a horrifying sense of déjà vu washing over her, cold and suffocating. The shelf of liquor bottles, impossibly whole, impossibly stocked, gleamed behind the bar, mocking the frantic cleanup they had performed just hours before, or was it hours? Time seemed to have become a viscous, distorted thing, looping back on itself, trapping them in its cruel embrace. Mark stood frozen beside her, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. His eyes darted between Sarah, Fitzwilliam slumped against the wall, and the pristine shelf of liquor, trying to reconcile the impossible reality unfolding before him. The rational, skeptical Mark was crumbling, replaced by a man facing a truth that defied all logic, all reason. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible, a denial more to himself than to Sarah. "No, this can't be happening, it's not possible." But it was happening. The undeniable reality was etched in the slumped form of Fitzwilliam, in the unbroken bottles, in the chilling echo of the entity's pronouncement. Sarah felt a cold dread seep into her soul, a crushing weight of despair that threatened to extinguish the fragile spark of hope that had flickered within her just moments before. They had tried to fight, they had tried to change fate, but it had all been for naught. The entity was too powerful, too insidious. They were trapped puppets in its cruel game, doomed to relive this moment, this tragedy again and again, for an eternity that stretched out before them, vast and terrifying. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, blurring her vision, but she couldn't look away from Fitzwilliam, from the agonizing repetition of his pain. It wasn't just about Havenwood anymore, about the town's sorrow, about the entity feeding on collective despair. It was personal now. It was about her, about Mark, about their futile struggle, their shattered hope, their impending torment. The entity wasn't just a force. It was a malicious intelligence, a sentient darkness that reveled in their suffering, that had crafted this temporal prison specifically for them, to break them, to consume them, to feast on their individual despair. Fitzwilliam groaned again, repeating the same words, the same intonation, the same weary resignation in his voice. "Shelf" came down out of nowhere. "Leg, think it's broken." Each word was a hammer blow against Sarah's already fragile resolve, each syllable a confirmation of their inescapable fate. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the scene, trying to escape the horrifying reality, but the image of Fitzwilliam's pain, the sound of his groan, the echoing phrase again and again and again, remained burned into her mind, inescapable, relentless. She was trapped not just in space, but in time, in this moment of tragedy, in this loop of despair orchestrated by the entity, designed to break her spirit. And then, amidst the crushing despair, a flicker of something else began to stir within Sarah, a spark of defiance, a refusal to succumb completely to the entity's cruel design. As much as the entity seemed to feed on sorrow, on despair, on fear, there was another emotion it seemed to provoke, a different kind of energy, a different kind of fuel: anger. A cold, burning anger directed not just at the entity, but at herself, at her own helplessness, at her own vulnerability. She opened her eyes, her gaze hardening, focusing on Fitzwilliam, on Mark, on the familiar surroundings of the rusty mug, but seeing them now with a newfound clarity, a stark understanding of their true nature, their true purpose within this temporal prison. The rusty mug wasn't just a bar anymore. It was a stage, a theater of torment designed to replay past tragedies, to amplify present despair, to feed the entity's insatiable hunger. And she, Sarah Miller, was not just the bartender. She was a player in this macabre drama, a central figure in the entity's twisted game. And as the anger solidified within her, a strange sense of calm began to descend, a chilling acceptance of their situation, but also a defiant resolve to not be broken, to not give the entity what it craved. If the entity wanted sorrow, wanted despair, wanted fear, she would not give it to it willingly. She would confront her own despair, she would face her own fears. She would delve into the darkness within herself, and she would find something else, something stronger, something that the entity could not consume, something that could perhaps, just perhaps, be used to fight back. She looked at Mark, his face still etched with shock and disbelief, but she saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes, a mirroring of her own dawning resolve. He too was beginning to grasp the full horror of their situation, but also perhaps the glimmer of a desperate hope that flickered beneath the surface of despair. "Mark," Sarah said, her voice stronger now, clearer, cutting through the echoing silence. "We're trapped. We're in a loop. It's reliving this." She gestured towards Fitzwilliam, towards the bar, towards the repeating scene of tragedy, over and over again. Mark nodded slowly, his gaze meeting hers, a shared understanding passing between them, a silent acknowledgement of the impossible reality they now faced. "I know," he said, his voice low but firm. "I see it, we're stuck. But we're not going to let it break us," Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength, her anger hardening into a steely resolve. "We're not going to give it what it wants, we're not going to let it feed on our despair." Mark looked at her, a flicker of hope igniting in his eyes, mirroring her own defiance. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice tinged with a desperate eagerness. "What can we do?" Sarah took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping across the bar, across Fitzwilliam, across the repeating scene of tragedy, but seeing it now not just as a source of despair, but as a key, a clue, a puzzle to be solved. "If it's feeding on our despair," she said, her voice thoughtful, her mind racing, "then maybe we need to starve it. Maybe we need to stop feeling despair. Maybe we need to confront it inside ourselves." Mark frowned, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Confront it inside ourselves? What are you talking about, Sarah?" Sarah looked at him, her eyes narrowing, her mind focusing, a plan beginning to form, a desperate, risky plan, but a plan nonetheless. "Think about it, Mark," she said, her voice gaining conviction. "The entity feeds on sorrow, on despair, on fear. It uses the past, the echoes of tragedy, to amplify those emotions. But those emotions, they're not just about Havenwood's past. They're about our past, our own traumas, our own regrets, our own personal darkness." She paused, taking another deep breath, her gaze turning inwards now, confronting the shadows within herself, the memories, the regrets, the fears that the entity was undoubtedly exploiting, feeding on, amplifying within this temporal prison. "My father," she whispered, the word catching in her throat, a long-buried pain surfacing, raw and sharp. "His accident, the fire, the guilt I've carried all these years." Mark's eyes softened with understanding, his expression shifting from confusion to a deep empathy. He knew about Sarah's past, about the tragic fire that had claimed her father's life, about the guilt she had carried ever since, the unspoken burden that had shaped her, that had haunted her, that had perhaps made her vulnerable to the entity's insidious influence. "And you," Sarah continued, turning to Mark, her gaze searching his, her voice gentle but firm. "Your mother, her illness, the helplessness you felt, the grief you still carry." Mark flinched, his eyes darkening with a familiar pain, a long-suppressed sorrow surfacing, raw and exposed. He too had his scars, his own personal darkness, the memory of his mother's long, agonizing illness, the helplessness he had felt as he watched her fade away, the grief that still lingered, a shadow in his heart. "The entity," Sarah said, her voice low but clear, the realization solidifying within her mind, "it's not just feeding on Havenwood's sorrow, it's feeding on ours, on our personal despair. It's using the temporal loop, the echoes of the past, to amplify our own traumas, to trap us in our own personal hells." She looked around the bar again, at Fitzwilliam, at Mark, at the familiar surroundings, but seeing them now not just as a prison, but as a battleground, a place where she had to confront not just the entity, but herself, her own past, her own darkness. And as she faced that realization, a strange sense of strength began to grow within her. A resolve to not be defined by her past, to not be consumed by her despair, to fight back, not just against the entity, but against herself, against the shadows within her own soul. "We have to confront our past, Mark," Sarah said, her voice gaining conviction, her eyes shining with a newfound determination. "We have to face our traumas, our regrets, our fears. We have to accept them, understand them, and then let them go. We have to starve the entity, Mark. We have to starve it of our despair. Mark looked at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe, a dawning understanding of her audacious plan. You think if we confront our own darkness," he stammered, his voice hesitant, "if we accept our past, it will weaken the entity, break the loop." Sarah didn't know if it would work. It was a desperate gamble, a leap of faith into the unknown, but it was the only path she could see, the only glimmer of hope in the overwhelming darkness. "I don't know, Mark," she admitted, her voice honest, her gaze unwavering. "But we have to try. We have to face our past, we have to find strength and acceptance, and we have to fight for our future, even if that future is trapped in this loop. We have to fight, Mark, for ourselves, for each other, for Havenwood. Again. And again and again." Her words hung in the air, a defiant declaration in the face of despair, a fragile seed of hope planted in the barren landscape of their temporal prison. The entity's chilling pronouncement, again and again and again, still echoed, a reminder of their seemingly inescapable fate. But within Sarah, a new resolve had taken root, a determination to not be defined by destiny, to not be consumed by sorrow, to find strength in acceptance, and to fight, even within the loop, for a future, however uncertain. HOWEVER, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, that was worth fighting for. And in Mark's eyes, she saw a mirroring of that resolve, a shared understanding that their battle was not over, but only just beginning. A battle not just against an external entity, but against the shadows within themselves. A battle for their souls, fought within the confines of the rusty mug, in the heart of a temporal loop, for a future that was still, impossibly, tantalizingly, within reach. Sarah's words hung in the air, a fragile defiance against the crushing weight of their predicament. Mark looked at her, his initial shock slowly giving way to a dawning understanding, a reflection of her own desperate resolve. He saw the fear in her eyes, the tremor in her voice, but beneath it, he also saw a spark of something stronger, a flicker of unwavering determination. "Confront our past," Mark repeated slowly, testing the phrase in his mind, the concept both terrifying and strangely liberating. "You mean like actually face it? Here, now?" He gestured around the bar, a place now imbued with a horrifying significance, a stage for their personal purgatory. "Yes," Sarah affirmed, her voice gaining strength with each word. "The entity is using this place, this loop, to amplify our despair, to trap us in our own darkness. But maybe if we confront that darkness, if we face our fears head-on, it will lose its power over us. Maybe it will lose its hold on this loop." Mark considered her words, his brow furrowed in thought. It was a radical idea, bordering on madness, but in the face of their impossible situation, it was the only one that offered even a sliver of hope. He thought of his mother, her frail form fading away in a hospital bed, the agonizing helplessness he had felt, the years of grief that still lingered, a constant ache in his heart. The entity had undoubtedly sensed that vulnerability, that deep-seated sorrow, and was using it against him, weaving it into the fabric of this temporal prison. "But how?" Mark asked, his voice laced with uncertainty. "How do we just confront our past? It's not like flipping a switch. These are deep wounds, Sarah, things we've buried for years." "I don't know exactly," Sarah admitted, her gaze turning inwards, searching for answers within the swirling chaos of her own thoughts. "But we have to start somewhere. We have to open ourselves up, expose our vulnerabilities, and see what happens. Maybe the entity will project our fears, our traumas into this loop. Maybe it will try to use them against us to break us completely." "And if it does," Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes wide with apprehension, "if it throws our worst nightmares back in our faces, what then?" "Then we face them," Sarah said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. "We don't run, we don't hide, we don't succumb to fear. We stand our ground, Mark. We confront those nightmares, those projections, whatever the entity throws at us. And we show it that we are not afraid. We show it that our past, our pain, does not define us. We show it that we are stronger than our sorrow." Her words resonated in the silent bar, a declaration of defiance against the unseen enemy, a fragile promise of resilience in the face of overwhelming despair. Mark looked at her, his initial fear slowly giving way to a dawning admiration, a renewed sense of hope. He saw the strength in her eyes, the unwavering resolve in her voice, and he knew that she was right. They couldn't run, they couldn't hide. They had to face the darkness, both within and without, if they ever hoped to break free from this temporal prison. "Okay," Mark said, his voice gaining strength, his fear slowly transforming into a steely determination. "Okay, I'm with you. We face it. We confront our past, but where do we start?" Sarah took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping around the bar, searching for a starting point, a focal point for their audacious plan. Her eyes landed on the security monitor, the flickering screen displaying the garbled images from the cameras, the distorted audio a constant reminder of the entity's insidious presence. "The recordings," she said suddenly, her voice thoughtful. "We started this whole thing with the recordings, with the overlapping audio, with the whispers from the past. Maybe that's where we need to begin. Maybe we need to listen again, to delve deeper into those echoes, to see if we can find clues, triggers, something that will help us confront our own darkness." Mark nodded, his brow furrowed in concentration. "The recordings," he repeated slowly. "You mean go back to the security footage, listen to the whispers again, even after everything that's happened?" "Yes," Sarah affirmed, her voice firm. "We have to. The entity is using the past against us, weaving it into this loop, amplifying our fears and sorrows. Maybe if we understand how it's doing that, if we delve deeper into the echoes of the past, we can find a way to break free. Maybe the answer is hidden in the whispers themselves." It was a risky proposition, venturing back into the unsettling realm of the overlapping audio, willingly exposing themselves to the entity's manipulative influence. But it was a risk they had to take. They had to confront the source of their torment, to delve into the darkness that had trapped them, if they ever hoped to find their way back to the light. They returned to the back office, the small, cramped space now feeling like a strange sanctuary, a place where they could confront their fears, their traumas, and the entity that was preying on them. Sarah slumped into the chair in front of the security monitor, her fingers trembling as she reached for the headphones, the familiar weight pressing against her ears, isolating her from the outside world, plunging her back into the unsettling realm of the overlapping audio. She pulled up the security footage program, the screen flickering to life, displaying the garbled images from the cameras, the distorted audio a chaotic mix of whispers and static. She hesitated for a moment, a wave of apprehension washing over her, the memory of the entity's chilling pronouncement, again and again and again, echoing in her mind. But then she took a deep breath, steeling herself, and clicked play. The chaotic audio filled her headphones, a swirling vortex of overlapping voices, whispers from the past, distorted fragments of conversations, a cacophony of unsettling sounds that seemed to press in on her, to invade her thoughts, to amplify her fears and anxieties. She closed her eyes, focusing intently, trying to filter out the noise, to discern any pattern, any meaning, any clue hidden within the chaotic whispers. And then, amidst the swirling chaos, she heard a voice, a distinct voice, clearer than the others, sharper, more insistent, a voice that seemed to cut through the noise, to speak directly to her, to resonate with a chilling familiarity. It was a man's voice, low, gravelly, tinged with a deep sorrow, a voice that sent a shiver of ice down her spine, a voice that she recognized with a jolt of painful recognition as her father's voice. "Sarah, my Sarah, forgive me." The words echoed in her headphones, reverberating through her skull, tearing through her defenses, unleashing a torrent of long-suppressed emotions, a flood of guilt, grief, and a raw, agonizing pain that she had buried deep within her heart for years. Her father's voice, a voice she hadn't heard in years, a voice she had longed to hear again, now whispering words of sorrow, words of forgiveness, words that pierced her soul like shards of glass. Her eyes snapped open, her breath catching in her throat, her heart pounding in her chest. The security monitor flickered, the images distorting further, the audio intensifying, the whispers swirling around her, amplifying her pain, her guilt, her deepest fears. The entity was responding. It was projecting her trauma, her deepest sorrow back at her, using her father's voice, her father's pain to break her, to consume her, to trap her even deeper within its temporal prison. But amidst the overwhelming pain, amidst the rising tide of despair, a flicker of defiance ignited within Sarah, a spark of anger, a refusal to succumb to the entity's cruel manipulation. It was using her father's voice against her, exploiting her deepest vulnerability, but she would not let it. She would not let her father's memory be twisted, be used as a weapon against her. She would confront her guilt, she would face her pain, she would not run, she would not hide. She would stand her ground and she would fight back. Tears streamed down her face, blurring her vision, but her gaze remained fixed on the flickering security monitor, on the distorted images, on the source of the entity's insidious whispers. She closed her eyes again, taking a deep breath, focusing on her father's voice, not as a weapon, not as a source of pain, but as a memory, a precious, though painful memory of love, of loss, of a bond that even death, even a malevolent entity, could not completely sever. "Father," she whispered, her voice trembling, her words barely audible above the chaotic whispers, but spoken with a newfound resolve, a fragile strength born from the depths of her sorrow. "Father, I forgive you, and I forgive myself." The words hung in the air, a fragile offering, a whispered plea for release, for forgiveness, for peace. And then something shifted. The whispers around her seemed to soften, to recede slightly, the chaotic audio becoming less intense, less oppressive. The flickering images on the security monitor steadied, becoming clearer, less distorted. The cold dread that had gripped her heart began to loosen its icy grip, replaced by a faint warmth, a subtle sense of release. Her father's voice, still echoing in her headphones, softened too, losing its edge of sorrow, becoming gentler, more comforting. "Sarah, my Sarah, I'm proud of you." The words washed over her, a balm to her wounded soul, a soothing whisper of acceptance, of love, of forgiveness. Tears continued to stream down her face, but they were no longer tears of despair, of guilt, of pain. They were tears of release, of catharsis, of a long-burdened heart finally beginning to heal. The entity's projection of her father, its attempt to exploit her deepest trauma, was losing its power. By confronting her guilt, by offering forgiveness, by choosing acceptance over despair, Sarah was starving the entity, weakening its hold, breaking free from its manipulative grasp. The temporal loop, the prison of her own making, was beginning to loosen its chains. And as she whispered words of forgiveness, of acceptance, of love, into the chaotic whispers of the past, a fragile hope began to bloom within her heart. A hope that maybe, just maybe, they could escape this nightmare, that they could reclaim their future, that they could finally silence the echoes of the past and step into a new dawn, free from the shadows of sorrow and despair. "Sarah, my Sarah, I'm proud of you," the words, soft as a caress yet resonating with an undeniable power, lingered in Sarah's ears, echoing through the chaotic whispers that had tormented her for so long. A profound sense of peace began to settle over her, a stillness that had been absent for what felt like an eternity. The crushing weight on her chest eased, the icy grip around her heart loosened, replaced by a warmth that spread through her, thawing the frozen despair within. She opened her eyes, blinking against the dim light of the office, the security monitor still flickering, but the images now clearer, less distorted, the audio, though still layered, less chaotic, less oppressive. The whispers, while not entirely gone, had receded into a gentler murmur, a background hum rather than a deafening roar. The oppressive dread that had permeated the air had lifted, replaced by a fragile, tentative sense of hope. Mark was watching her, his face etched with concern but also a flicker of awe, of understanding. He had witnessed the shift in the atmosphere, the sudden calming of the chaotic energy that had been swirling around them. He had seen the tears streaming down her face, not tears of despair, but tears of release, of catharsis. He knew, instinctively, that something profound had just happened, that Sarah had taken a crucial step in their desperate battle against the entity. "Sarah," he asked softly, his voice filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Are you all right? What happened?" Sarah took a deep breath, the air filling her lungs feeling cleaner, lighter than it had in days. She wiped the tears from her face, a faint smile gracing her lips. I think it worked, Mark," she whispered, her voice still trembling slightly but now infused with a newfound strength. I think I confronted my guilt. I forgave my father, and I forgave myself." Mark's eyes widened with understanding, a dawning realization spreading across his face. "You mean the entity, it was feeding on your guilt, on your trauma?" Sarah nodded, her gaze fixed on the security monitor, on the now steadier images, the less chaotic audio. "Yes," she said, her voice gaining conviction. "It was using my father's memory, my deepest sorrow, to break me, to trap me in this loop. But when I forgave him, when I let go of the guilt, it lost its power. It weakened." Mark let out a slow breath, a sigh of relief and wonder. "So, confronting our past, it actually works." "I think so," Sarah replied, her voice thoughtful. "It's like the entity feeds on negative energy, on sorrow, on despair, on fear. But when we confront those emotions, when we accept our pain, when we choose forgiveness and acceptance over despair, we starve it. We cut off its food source." A new wave of hope surged through them both, a fragile, tentative hope, but a hope nonetheless. They had found a way to fight back, not through brute force, not through rituals and symbols alone, but through a deeper, more personal confrontation, a battle fought within the depths of their own souls. "Okay," Mark said, his voice firm, his eyes shining with a renewed determination. "Okay, then we do it. We both do it. We confront our past, we face our traumas, and we starve that thing until it withers and dies." He looked at Sarah, his gaze filled with a shared resolve. "Where do we start?" Sarah considered for a moment, her mind racing, searching for a starting point for Mark's own confrontation, for his own personal darkness. She knew about his mother's illness, about the years of suffering, the agonizing helplessness, the lingering grief that still haunted him. That was his vulnerability, his open wound, the source of the entity's insidious influence on him. "Your mother, Mark," Sarah said gently, her voice filled with compassion. "Her illness, her passing, the grief you still carry. The entity is using that too. I can feel it in the whispers and the echoes of sorrow that surround us. You have to confront that pain, Mark. You have to face your grief and let it go." Mark flinched slightly, his eyes darkening with a familiar pain, a long-suppressed sorrow surfacing, raw and exposed. The memory of his mother, her frail smile, her gentle voice, her agonizing decline flooded his mind, a torrent of grief threatening to overwhelm him. It was a wound he had carefully guarded, a pain he had buried deep within his heart, afraid to touch it, afraid to reopen it, afraid of the darkness that lurked within. I don't know if I can, Sarah," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion, his gaze turning inwards, lost in the labyrinth of his own grief. It's too painful. It's been too long. I don't know if I can face it again." "You have to, Mark," Sarah said, her voice firm but gentle, placing a hand on his arm, her touch offering strength and support. "Not just for yourself, but for Havenwood, for everyone trapped in this loop. The entity is feeding on your pain, Mark. It's using your grief to keep us trapped here. If you want to break free, if you want to save Havenwood, you have to confront it. You have to face your sorrow and let it go." Mark looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperation, a dawning understanding of the impossible task that lay before him. He knew she was right. He had to confront his grief, he had to face his pain, he had to open himself up to the darkness within if he ever hoped to escape this temporal prison, to banish the entity, to save Havenwood. But the prospect terrified him. It felt like diving into a bottomless abyss, a descent into a darkness that threatened to consume him completely. "But how?" he stammered, his voice trembling, his gaze pleading for guidance, for a way to navigate the treacherous terrain of his own grief. "How do I just let go of something that's been a part of me for so long? How do I just stop grieving?" "You don't stop grieving, Mark," Sarah said softly, her voice filled with understanding and compassion. "You don't forget, you accept. You acknowledge the pain, you honor the memory, but you don't let it define you. You don't let it control you. You let go of the sorrow, Mark, not of the love." Her words resonated within him, a glimmer of understanding breaking through the fog of his grief. He looked at Sarah, her face etched with a mixture of determination and empathy, and he saw not just a friend, but a fellow traveler on this perilous journey, someone who understood his pain, someone who was willing to walk beside him into the darkness, to help him find his way back to the light. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, his fear slowly transforming into a fragile resolve. "Okay," he said, his voice low but firm, his gaze unwavering. "Okay, I'll do it, I'll face it. I'll confront my grief, but I don't know where to start." Sarah smiled gently, her hand tightening on his arm, offering support and encouragement. "Start with your memories, Mark," she said softly. "Think of your mother, remember the good times, the happy moments, the love you shared. Don't focus on the pain, don't dwell on the sorrow. Focus on the love, Mark. Focus on the love and let that guide you through the darkness." Mark closed his eyes, taking another deep breath, his mind turning inwards, venturing into the labyrinth of his memories, seeking the light amidst the shadows of his grief. The whispers around them seemed to intensify again, sensing his vulnerability, sensing his fear, swirling around him, trying to amplify his sorrow, to pull him deeper into the abyss of despair. But this time there was a difference. This time he wasn't running from the darkness. He was facing it. He was confronting his grief, not with fear, but with acceptance, with love, with a fragile hope that he could find his way through the pain and out into the light. He remembered his mother's smile, the warmth of her embrace, the sound of her laughter, the stories she used to tell him, the songs she used to sing. He remembered the happy moments, the cherished memories, the love that had bound them together, a love that transcended even death, even the entity's insidious influence. He focused on those memories, those moments of love and joy, letting them wash over him, letting them soothe his wounded soul, letting them push back against the encroaching darkness. As he delved deeper into his memories, a strange thing began to happen. The whispers around him seemed to change, to shift in tone, losing their menacing edge, becoming softer, gentler, almost wistful. The overlapping voices seemed to coalesce, to harmonize, weaving together not a cacophony of sorrow, but a chorus of remembrance, a tapestry of shared experiences, a symphony of love and loss. And amidst the chorus, he heard a voice, a distinct voice, clearer than the others, softer, more comforting, a voice that resonated with a deep familiarity, a voice that he recognized with a surge of bittersweet emotion as his mother's voice. "Mark, my darling Mark, don't be sad for me." The words, soft as a whisper, yet resonating with an undeniable love, washed over him, soothing his pain, easing his grief, filling him with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. His mother's voice, a voice he had thought he would never hear again, now whispering words of comfort, words of love, words that healed his wounded heart, that mended the broken threads of his soul. He opened his eyes, tears streaming down his face, but they were no longer tears of sorrow, of grief, of pain. They were tears of release, of acceptance, of a long-burdened heart finally beginning to heal. He looked at Sarah, his face etched with a mixture of sorrow and peace, his eyes shining with a newfound light. "I heard her, Sarah," he whispered, his voice trembling, his gaze filled with awe and wonder. "I heard my mother's voice. She said not to be sad for her." Sarah smiled gently, tears streaming down her own face, a shared catharsis washing over them both, a profound sense of connection, of understanding, of shared humanity in the face of overwhelming darkness. "She's at peace, Mark," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with love and compassion. "She wants you to be at peace too." As Mark embraced his grief, as he found solace in his memories, as he chose acceptance over sorrow, the entity's hold on him and on the temporal loop began to weaken. The whispers continued to fade, the chaotic audio softening further, the oppressive atmosphere of the rusty mug lightning becoming almost normal. The shadows seemed to recede, the air feeling cleaner, purer, devoid of the malevolent energy that had permeated it for so long. They had confronted their past, they had faced their traumas, they had starved the entity of their despair. And as their personal darkness began to recede, the entity's grip on Havenwood, on the rusty mug, on the temporal loop, began to loosen. The whispers were fading, the shadows were receding, the air was clearing. The dawn was breaking, not just outside the windows of the rusty mug, but within their own souls, within the heart of Havenwood, promising a new beginning. A chance to rebuild, to heal, to move forward, free from the echoes of the past and the shadows of the entity. But the pocket watch remained, a final tether, a lingering connection to the entity's power, a final obstacle to overcome before they could truly break free and reclaim their future. The comforting words of their loved ones lingered in the air of the office, a balm to Sarah and Mark's wounded souls. The oppressive weight that had burdened them for days seemed to lift, replaced by a tentative lightness, a fragile sense of hope blossoming in the darkness. The whispers, though still present, were now a distant murmur, a faint echo of the torment that had been. The security monitor, once a chaotic swirl of static and distortion, now showed a steadier image, the bar beyond the office door appearing almost normal. Sarah and Mark remained in the office, the small space feeling less claustrophobic, less menacing than it had moments before. They sat in a comfortable silence, allowing the peace to settle over them, absorbing the quiet relief that washed away the frantic energy of their desperate fight. Tears continued to stream down their faces, but now they were tears of release, of catharsis, a cleansing rain that washed away the accumulated sorrow and fear. After a long moment, Mark stirred, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, a weak smile gracing his lips. I feel different," he murmured, his voice hoarse with emotion, his gaze searching Sarah's. Lighter, like a weight has been lifted. Sarah nodded, mirroring his smile, a genuine smile that reached her eyes, the first she had felt in what seemed like an eternity. "Me too," she whispered, her voice still trembling slightly but now infused with a newfound strength. "It's like we finally let go of something that was holding us back, something the entity was feeding on." They stood up slowly, their limbs feeling heavy, their bodies exhausted but their spirits strangely buoyant. They moved out of the office, stepping back into the main bar area, their senses adjusting to the relative brightness, the now palpable sense of calm that permeated the rusty mug. The bar was still deserted, eerily silent, but the oppressive atmosphere, the malevolent energy that had clung to the air, had vanished. The flickering lights were steady, casting a warm, inviting glow across the familiar space. The shadows, though still present, seemed less menacing, less alive, no longer writhing with unseen energy. It's quiet," Mark observed, his voice echoing slightly in the empty bar, a stark contrast to the chaotic cacophony of moments before. He looked around, his gaze sweeping across the bar stools, the tables, the shelves, taking in the familiar details with a sense of wonder, a sense of rediscovering a place that had been lost to them, consumed by darkness. "Really quiet." Sarah nodded, her gaze mirroring his, taking in the silence, the stillness, the almost unnerving emptiness of the rusty mug. "Too quiet," she murmured, a hint of unease creeping back into her voice, a fragile hope tinged with a lingering uncertainty. "Where is everyone, Mark? Havenwood, it's still deserted, isn't it?" They moved to the front door, peering out onto Main Street, the pale morning light now stronger, illuminating the deserted town, the empty storefronts, the silent streets. Havenwood remained a ghost town, devoid of life, locked in an unnatural stillness that felt both peaceful and profoundly unsettling. "Still gone," Mark confirmed, his brow furrowed with concern. "It's like they vanished into thin air. Where could they have gone, Sarah? If the entity is weakened, banished, or whatever, why isn't everyone back?" Sarah shook her head, her gaze sweeping across the empty streets, her mind racing, trying to make sense of the lingering silence, the continued absence of Havenwood's inhabitants. Maybe it's not completely gone," she whispered, a chill tracing its way down her spine. "Maybe confronting our personal darkness. Maybe it weakened the entity's hold on us, on the rusty mug, but maybe it's still out there somewhere, still influencing Havenwood, still holding on to the town." Her gaze fell on the safe in the proprietor's office, the open door revealing the empty velvet cushion where the pocket watch had rested. "The watch, Mark," she said suddenly, her voice sharp with realization. "The pocket watch, it's still gone. We didn't destroy it, we didn't reclaim it. It just vanished. Maybe that's the key. Maybe the watch is still the entity's anchor, its connection to Havenwood, even if we've broken its direct hold on us." Mark's eyes widened, his expression shifting from concern to a renewed sense of urgency. "You think so?" he breathed, his voice tinged with a desperate hope. "You think if we can find the watch, if we can destroy it, or reclaim it, maybe that will break the entity's hold on Havenwood completely?" "It's the only thing that makes sense," Sarah replied, her voice firm, her gaze fixed on the empty safe, the missing watch now a symbol of their unfinished battle, their lingering uncertainty. "The entity used the watch to amplify its power, to trap us in the loop. Maybe it's still drawing power from it, even now. Maybe as long as the watch exists, as long as it's still connected to the entity, Havenwood will remain trapped, silent, empty." A new sense of purpose ignited within them, a renewed determination to complete their task, to find the watch, to sever the entity's final link to Havenwood, to break free from the temporal loop and restore their town to its former self. But the watch was gone, vanished without a trace in the blinding flash of light, leaving them with no clue as to its whereabouts, no idea how to retrieve it. "But where do we even start looking?" Mark asked, his voice laced with frustration, his gaze sweeping around the office, the bar, the empty town beyond, a sense of the enormity of their task settling upon him. "It could be anywhere. It could be anywhere in time, for all we know." Sarah considered for a moment, her mind racing, trying to find a starting point, a direction for their renewed search. Her gaze fell on the security monitor again, the flickering screen still displaying the garbled images, the distorted audio, a constant reminder of the entity's lingering presence, its insidious influence still woven into the fabric of the rusty mug. "The recordings, Mark," she said again, her voice thoughtful, her gaze fixed on the monitor, her mind drawn back to the source of their ordeal, the whispers from the past that had led them down this terrifying path. Maybe the answer is still in the recordings. Maybe the entity left a clue, a hint, something that will tell us where the watch has gone. Maybe we need to listen again, to delve even deeper into the whispers, to see if we can find the missing piece of the puzzle. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, venturing back into the unsettling realm of the overlapping audio, willingly exposing themselves to the entity's lingering influence. But it was the only lead they had, the only path they could see in the face of the overwhelming uncertainty. They had to find the watch, they had to break the entity's final hold on Havenwood. And if the answer lay hidden in the echoes of the past, in the whispers from another time, then they had no choice but to listen, to delve deeper, to risk everything again and again and again. And so, with a shared glance of grim determination, Sarah and Mark turned back to the security monitor, their hearts pounding with a mixture of hope and trepidation, their ears straining to decipher the whispers from the past. Their minds focused on the impossible task of finding a missing pocket watch, a key to unlocking Havenwood's future, hidden somewhere within the labyrinthine echoes of time, in the heart of the rusty mug where the shadows still lingered and the whispers still echoed, waiting to be heard.